Section 1. Springfield's hidden geography and the Easter eggs buried in plain sight. Let's start somewhere comfortable. Picture Springfield at night. The streets are quiet in the specific way that streets in mid-sized American towns get quiet around 10 or 11 o'clock, when the last few businesses have shut down their lights and the only motion is the occasional car moving between intersections that stay green even when no one needs them to. The power plant is there on the horizon. The way it is always on the horizon, its cooling towers pushing steam into air that is cool enough to hold it in visible columns before it disperses into the black. The quick E-Mart is still open. It is always open. This is a fact about Springfield so consistent across 36 seasons that it has become a kind of law, a rule as reliable as anything else in a town where the rules are constantly being quietly renegotiated without anyone formally announcing the change. Moe's Tavern has its neon sign-off, but the door is probably not locked, because Moe does not always lock the door. The Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace has a single window lit upstairs. Homer watching television in bed? Marge beside him, her hair somehow maintaining its full vertical tower even against a pillow, which is the kind of detail you stop questioning after a while and simply accept, the way you accept most things about Springfield after long enough. It is a peaceful image. And it is, if you look at it with enough attention, absolutely full of things that do not quite add up. That is what we are doing tonight. For the next several hours, we are going to walk through Springfield very slowly, which is the best speed for Springfield, because the town rewards slowness in a way it does not reward hurrying. We are going to look at the things hiding in plain sight, the things the show placed there deliberately over 3.5 decades, the things buried in backgrounds and throwaway lines and details that only resolve if you already know something about the history of the show, or the people who made it, or the specific arguments that happened in the writer's room on specific days in specific years. This is the Simpsons Iceberg, version 4. Which means we are operating on the assumption that you have already done some reading. You know the famous theories. You know about the floating timeline and the three-eyed fish. You know about the coma theory and the radiation theory and the Burns immortality question. We are not going back over that ground tonight, not directly, because that ground has been covered. We are going somewhere with more specific and less famous things to examine. So settle in, get genuinely comfortable, turn the lights down if that is what your environment allows. This is designed to be something you can follow with the part of your mind that stays active when the rest of you is winding down, something with enough substance to feel satisfying and enough gentleness to let sleep come when sleep is ready. Let's begin with the town itself. Springfield is not just a setting for The Simpsons. It is a character in the show in the fullest sense of the word, meaning it has a personality and a history and a set of consistent behaviors and a set of very specific inconsistencies. And all of those things tell you something real about what the show is doing and why it has held together for as long as it has. The first thing that rewards attention when you actually sit with Springfield's physical layout is that it is impossible. Not impossible in the vague way that cartoon geography is always somewhat impossible, where you accept without examination that the distances between locations change depending on the plot requirements of any given week. Springfield is specifically, precisely, geographically impossible in ways that someone clearly designed deliberately, with choices made at specific points in the show's history about what Springfield would and would not contain. Let's go through the inventory, because the inventory is the point. Springfield has a harbor with functional shipping access to open water. This is not ambiguous or subject to interpretation. There are multiple episodes in which boats of significant size depart from a recognizable Springfield waterfront, a pier district with the architecture and infrastructure of an actual working harbor, the kind that requires dredging and maintenance and a local maritime economy to justify its existence. The harbor is real within the show's universe. It exists, and it functions. This means Springfield is either coastal or has navigable river access to a coast. Springfield also has a mountain range, not hills, not rolling terrain. An actual mountain range with slopes high enough for ski infrastructure, including lifts and lodges, and the kind of consistent vertical terrain that produces competitive downhill skiing. This range appears in at least 3 separate episodes with enough visual specificity that the scale of these mountains is not ambiguous. They are mountains in the full sense of the word, and they are apparently accessible from downtown Springfield by a drive of no great length. Springfield additionally has a desert, a proper arid desert with red rock formations and the kind of open, heat-shimmered landscape that appears in the background of highway scenes when certain characters are driving through the outskirts of town. This is not a small dry patch. It is a full desert environment of the kind you find in the American Southwest, and it exists in apparent proximity to the same town that has both a harbor and a mountain range. There is the Gorge, which is an enormous canyon feature we will discuss at length shortly. There is dense forest of the kind you get in the Pacific Northwest, with old-growth trees and the atmospheric quality of woodland that has been accumulating itself for a long time. There is flat agricultural land, proper farming terrain consistent with the American heartland. There is a downtown dense enough to suggest a population of several 100,000. There are suburbs. There is an older industrial district, the kind associated with the Rust Belt's period of greatest activity. No American town has all of these things simultaneously and in proximity. The geographic requirements for a harbor, a mountain range, a desert, dense old-growth forest, and flat agricultural land cannot all be met by a single real location in the continental United States. There is no zip code you could assign to Springfield that would make the surrounding landscape consistent with what the show depicts. This is not a mistake. This is a decision, made early and maintained deliberately, to give Springfield an impossible geography that serves the show's purposes. The purpose is both simple and sophisticated. Springfield needs to be able to produce any kind of episode: a fishing episode, a skiing episode, a desert road trip episode, a wilderness survival episode. If the town had a fixed and realistic location, every departure from that location's natural geography would require narrative justification that takes time and attention away from the actual story. By making the geography impossible from the beginning, the writers eliminated an entire category of continuity problems before those problems could accumulate. Springfield can be wherever the episode needs it to be, because Springfield has always been wherever it needs to be. The impossibility is a creative technology. It expands what the show can attempt without the friction of having to account for the expansion. But here is the counterpoint that rewards careful watching across many episodes. Springfield's core geography is actually quite stable. Not the edges, not the harbor or the mountain range or the desert. The immediate neighborhood where the main characters live and work, a roughly 6 to 8 block radius centered on Evergreen Terrace and extending to the Quickie Mart and the elementary school, and Moe's Tavern and the immediate downtown area, is drawn with surprising consistency across many seasons and many different animation teams. The power plant is always positioned in roughly the same direction relative to the Simpson house. The gorge is always in the same general direction from downtown. The school and the church have a consistent spatial relationship to each other that holds up across decades. There is a mental map of Springfield's core that the production maintained with real discipline even while the show's periphery expanded and contracted freely in whatever direction any given episode required. This tells you something important about how the show was made and what the people making it cared about. The writers and artists had an agreed-upon internal geography for the central zone of Springfield, a map that existed in the collective imagination of the production team and that was referenced consistently enough to keep the core stable. The inconsistency at the edges was deliberate creative freedom. The stability at the center was discipline, the commitment to maintaining a recognizable neighborhood that the audience could navigate by feel even across 36 seasons. Both were choices, and both served the show. The Easter eggs embedded in The Simpsons reward attention in a way that almost no other long-running American television show has attempted at the same sustained level, and the variety of forms they take is itself part of what makes them interesting. The most famous category is what might be called the pause and read variety. This is the practice of placing text on screen that moves through frame too quickly for a normal viewing speed to capture, but that is completely legible when the image is stopped. The show has been doing this since approximately its third season, and the range of content in these frozen frame moments is remarkable. Some of them are extensions of the main joke, background text that adds an additional layer to something the plot is already doing in the foreground. But many of them have no relationship to the episode they appear in at all. They are private jokes between members of the production team, references so specific that understanding them requires knowledge of the show's internal history that no general audience could possess. These messages were not put there for you. They were put there for the production team, for the animators and writers who would see the final product and who, if they happened to freeze the frame in the right place, would understand a joke that essentially nobody else in the world could fully understand. This is a specific kind of communication that only survives within a creative community that has strong enough internal cohesion to generate shared references, and the existence of these messages tells you something real about the culture of the show during the years they were being produced most densely. The decision to embed jokes for an audience of essentially zero is a decision made by people who cared about the world of Springfield as a complete thing rather than as a product to be delivered. They were investing creative energy in moments that would never be seen by the people the show was officially made for because the investment felt right, because the world of Springfield should be complete even in the parts nobody looks at. The background art in the show carries a similar quality. Springfield's storefronts have names that are quiet jokes, not the broad parody names that a less careful show would use, but specific jokes that reward familiarity with a particular register of dark American humor. Funeral homes with names that are grim puns about grief and commerce. Businesses with names that are references to historical events the show has no obligation to reference. Institutions whose signage implies a darker version of Springfield's civic life than anything the plots explore. These are all in the background. None of them are commented on. No character ever points at the funeral home with the grim name and says anything about it. It just exists. One more quietly absurd detail in a town whose entire existence is quietly absurd. The newspapers that appear in Simpsons episodes deserve particular attention because they are consistently better than they need to be by a substantial margin. When a Springfield newspaper appears in a scene, its headline is always visible and usually legible at normal viewing speed, and those headlines are reliably excellent jokes that serve no narrative purpose whatsoever. The newspaper appears for 2 or 3 seconds. Its headline is a good joke. Nobody reads it. Nobody needs to read it. The show needed a newspaper prop, and someone wrote a good joke for that prop because they thought it was funny and they wanted it to be there, for themselves, for the few viewers who would notice. This is the production culture of the peak Simpsons era made visible in miniature. The standard of quality that governed what went into the show did not stop at the level of things the audience was obviously going to notice. It extended to 2-second props, to background signage, to text that would only be legible if you stopped the tape. The culture of the show during those years held that everything in the frame should be as good as anyone would make it, including the things nobody was going to look at closely enough to evaluate. There is a category of Easter egg in The Simpsons that has received far less attention than it deserves, which is the background character who appears in episodes years before they are ever named or given a speaking role, and who appears with enough consistency that the evidence suggests a character was fully conceived before they were introduced to the audience. The background population of Springfield, built up over 36 seasons, numbers in the hundreds of distinct character designs. Every crowd scene in a Springfield auditorium or schoolyard or sports event is populated by faces that have appeared before, many of which have appeared dozens of times across different episodes and different seasons. Some of these faces were eventually elevated to speaking roles. Others remained permanently in the background, unnamed and narrative-free, present in Springfield without ever having a story the audience was allowed to follow. What makes the best of these background residents interesting is the evidence they offer of careful design work applied to figures who might never have been expected to become narratively significant. The visual design of certain background Springfield residents is specific and internally consistent in ways that exceed what was needed to fill a crowd scene. The details in these designs, in posture and clothing and expression, and the specific quality of how they seem to relate to the world around them, suggest characters whose personalities were at least sketched out by whoever designed them, even if those personalities never made it into a script. When background characters were eventually promoted to speaking roles, the writers sometimes found that the visual design they were working with was already carrying strong implications about the character's personality, and they wrote toward those implications rather than starting from scratch. The result is that some of the show's best developed secondary characters feel like they were always there, fully present in Springfield, just waiting for the camera to turn their way long enough to notice them. The addresses in The Simpsons are a rabbit hole that takes you surprisingly far if you follow them carefully. 742. Evergreen Terrace is one of the most famous fictional addresses in American television. It has appeared on merchandise, in promotional materials, in articles and books and academic papers about the show. It is the address the entire production orbits around, the fixed domestic point from which all of Springfield radiates outward. And it has problems. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has a specific spatial relationship to the Flanders house next door that is established firmly in the show's early seasons and then maintained inconsistently across subsequent ones. Ned Flanders lives immediately next door, to the left of the Simpsons house as you face it from the street. This is one of the show's most firmly established geographic facts. But the precise spatial relationship between the two properties, the distance between the houses, the configuration of the shared fence, the relative orientation of the two driveways, varies noticeably depending on which episode and which animation team you are watching. In some episodes, the houses are separated by a modest yard with a fence that clearly marks the property line at a consistent distance from each house. In others, they appear almost directly adjacent, with very little space between the structures. In still others, the yard space has expanded considerably, giving both properties more room than their established location on a suburban residential street would logically accommodate. None of these versions is dramatically wrong. All of them are within the range of possible suburban property configurations. But they are not the same configuration, and the variation is noticeable once you start comparing episodes side by side. The zip codes are more interesting. When official Springfield documents appear in episodes, correspondence from government agencies, court documents, property records, utility bills, the zip code assigned to Springfield varies. Multiple different zip codes have appeared across the show's run, and none of them consistently corresponds to any single real American state. The zip code variation is part of the show's sustained and deliberate campaign to prevent Springfield's location from being pinned down by any single piece of real-world geographic information. If every piece of Springfield correspondence used the same zip code, someone would look it up, and the question of Springfield's location would be resolved by something as mundane as postal geography. The varying zip codes close that door permanently. Let's talk about the gorge, because it deserves extended attention. Springfield Gorge appears for the first time in the second season episode Bart the Daredevil, in a sequence that is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of sustained physical comedy the show has ever produced. The setup takes its time, escalating through Bart's failed attempt to skateboard across the gorge, and then Homer's subsequent attempt on a motorcycle, and the escalation is managed with a precision that makes the eventual length of Homer's fall both logically earned and surprising in its duration. The joke keeps going after you expect it to stop, and then it keeps going again. The gorge has to be large enough to hold all of this falling, and it is. It is enormous. But subsequent appearances of the gorge are not always consistent with the scale established in the Daredevil episode. Sometimes the gorge appears at that full, enormous scale, the proper canyon with hundreds of feet of vertical drop and a significant horizontal span. Other times it appears in a considerably more modest form, something closer to a steep-sided river valley than a true canyon. The gorge changes size between appearances. The production explanation is the straightforward one. Different animation teams with different reference materials and different directors interpreted the gorge at different scales in different episodes, without an explicit note specifying the precise dimensions that needed to be maintained. This is almost certainly part of what happened. But here is the reading that sits alongside the production explanation and adds something to it. Springfield's physical features are elastic in a way that serves the story, rather than a way that serves geographic precision. The gorge is as wide and as deep as the narrative needs it to be in any given episode. When it needs to be the fatal abyss where extraordinary physical consequences become possible, it is the enormous canyon. When it is a background element, it contracts to something that creates texture in the frame without dominating it. This quality of Springfield's physical reality bending around narrative requirements is not a bug. It is one of the mechanisms through which the show maintains its ability to tell any kind of story in the same setting. One more geographic detail before we leave this territory, and it is the one that requires the most careful attention to notice. The show maintains a consistent relationship between the Simpson house and the sky. Specifically, the sky visible from the backyard of 742 Evergreen Terrace has, in multiple episodes across multiple seasons, a quality of openness that feels larger than the suburban street grid would suggest. The backyard in the show functions as a threshold space, the boundary between the domestic interior of the family's life and whatever Springfield holds beyond it. The sky above the backyard is, in a quiet and unannounced way, the show's visual marker for the possibility of something different. When Bart sits on the roof of the house, which he does in several episodes, The view from that position includes the cooling towers of the power plant visible in one direction and the downtown silhouette visible in another. The roof is the one location from which Springfield's full geographic situation becomes visible simultaneously. The industrial and the civic and the domestic all in the same frame. The show uses this location for episodes where the story requires a character to see their situation whole for a moment. It is a deliberate compositional choice that the show returns to consistently enough to count as a recurring visual language. Springfield's geography is a text. It rewards reading. If you are still with me and you are comfortable, drop something in the comments before you drift. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. The geographic spread of who ends up in Springfield at this hour is something I find genuinely interesting. The range of people in different parts of the world choosing the same corner of this impossible town to settle into. And if this is the kind of thing you want to find in your feed again, subscribing is how that happens. Number. Section 2. The Writer's Room Secrets and Hidden Messages. The Simpsons writing room during its peak years was one of the most unusual creative environments in the history of American television, and the description unusual is doing real work there that requires unpacking because the room was unusual in several different and simultaneously operating ways. The room was unusually educated by any standard of television production. A significant proportion of the writing staff during the peak seasons held advanced degrees from elite universities. Multiple writers had done graduate work in fields that had no obvious connection to comedy writing, including mathematics, physics, history, philosophy, computer science, and various subfields of literature and linguistics. The educational demographics of that writer's room were more consistent with the faculty of a research university than with a network comedy writing staff. This was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate strategy on the part of the show's early leadership to hire people whose intelligence exceeded the demands of the job description, on the theory that intelligent people bored by their assignment will fill the excess capacity with ambitious work. The theory was correct. The room was also unusually democratic in its creative process, despite being organized along normal television hierarchy. The showrunner had final authority, as television hierarchies require, but the process of reaching that final authority's decisions involved a degree of collective engagement with every script that is not standard in television production. Every writer in the room was expected to contribute at a line level to every script, regardless of whose script it was, regardless of where the writer sat in the room's formal pecking order. The revision process was genuinely collective in the sense that contributions were evaluated on their merits rather than on the status of whoever offered them. A new writer's joke replacement could survive into the final episode over a senior writer's original line if the room judged the replacement funnier. This happened regularly enough that everyone knew it could happen, which maintained a level of effort and quality across the room's full hierarchy. The room was additionally quite competitive in ways that were simultaneously productive and exhausting. The combination of high educational attainment, strong personal creative ambitions, and a working environment that evaluated everyone's contributions simultaneously against everyone else's created an intellectual pressure that produced excellent work at the cost of the individual comfort of the people doing the work. Writers describe the experience of pitching jokes in that environment as one of the most demanding professional experiences of their careers, because the joke had to survive evaluation by a room full of people who were each individually convinced that they understood comedy at a sophisticated level, and most of them were right about themselves. The room was also, and consequentially, quite secretive about its internal dynamics during the years the show was at its most vital. The internal conflicts, the creative arguments, the specific circumstances under which specific creative decisions were made, these things were not the subject of public discussion while the show was being produced. They surfaced gradually, years and eventually decades later, through DVD commentaries and interviews and memoirs, and the normal mechanisms through which production history eventually becomes available to the public. The result is that much of what we know about how the peak seasons were made comes from retrospective accounts, which have the advantages and disadvantages of retrospective accounts everywhere. They are more complete than contemporaneous records and less accurate than fresh memory. The show's collective revision process is the single most important structural feature of how the writer's room generated its output, and understanding it is the key to understanding why the peak seasons have specific qualities that the later seasons lack. In most television writing rooms, scripts are revised through a process that preserves the identity of the originating writer. The collective input modifies and improves the original material, but leaves the overall vision of the originating writer recognizable in the final product. The show that airs reflects the originating writer's vision, processed through collective feedback. The Simpsons during its peak years worked differently. The collective revision process was thorough enough, and the room's investment in every script was complete enough, that scripts sometimes emerged from the revision process substantially different from what was originally submitted. The room would work on a script collectively, with each writer contributing joke alternatives, structural suggestions, character voice corrections, and scene restructuring, and the final product was genuinely collaborative in a way that most television scripts are not. The originating writer might not recognize the final product as primarily their work, and this was understood to be an acceptable outcome rather than a failure of the process. This had specific consequences for quality that are directly traceable in the episodes. The character voices in the peak Simpsons are extraordinarily precise and extraordinarily consistent across many seasons and many different lead writers. This is not simply the product of good voice casting, though the voice cast's contribution to character consistency is real and significant. It is also the product of a collective revision process that caught deviations from established character voice in real time and corrected them before the script reached production. If a writer's Homer was slightly off, missing the specific combination of warmth and inadvertent insight and genuine lovability underneath the incompetence that makes Homer work, someone in the room would notice, and the line would be rewritten until it was right. The character voices were being calibrated collectively, continuously, across every season and every episode, with each revision cycle adding precision to the established characterization. The consequence of this continuous collective calibration is that the show's characters are extraordinarily recognizable, even in episodes that are not otherwise excellent. A mediocre Simpsons episode from the peak years still produces Homer and Marge and Lisa and Burns with enough precision and enough consistency that they feel like the same people you have known for decades. The collective revision process maintained character integrity as a floor, below which the writing would not fall, regardless of the quality of any individual episode's plot or jokes. The cold read is the practice that most directly accounts for the structural quality of Simpsons jokes in the peak years, and it is the practice least discussed in most accounts of how the show was made. A cold read in the Simpsons context was an internal reading of a script in progress, conducted by the writers themselves, with everyone reading every role they were given in a deliberately flat, de-performed monotone. The instruction was to strip away any performance quality, any inflection or timing or emotional coloring, and read the words as if reading a grocery list. The flatness was the point. The reasoning is simple but important. When you read your own writing aloud, even to yourself, your brain is simultaneously producing the words and performing the intention behind them. You know what the joke is supposed to be, and your reading of the words is unconsciously shaped by that knowledge. You hear the joke landing because you hear what you intended, not just what you wrote. This is why so much writing sounds good to its author and falls flat when someone else reads it without that internal knowledge of what was intended. The cold read removes the author's intention from the equation. When everyone reads every role in the same flat voice with no performance investment, the writing has to stand on its own. The joke works or it does not, entirely on the basis of what is actually written rather than how it could theoretically be performed. A joke that only works with specific timing or specific emphasis is a joke that needs more work. A joke that works in the flat cold read works structurally, in the writing itself, and will work for any actor performing it at any reasonable pace. This is why Simpsons jokes translate well across languages and across different voice casts in international versions. The jokes were designed, through the cold read filter, to be structurally self-sufficient rather than performance-dependent. A structurally self-sufficient joke can be rendered by any performer in any language who understands what the joke is doing and can communicate that structure through their delivery. The cold read produced comedy built at the level of construction rather than execution. The hidden messages in the show's writing are real and they are diverse in form. The most consistently present is the economic anxiety subtext, encoded in the specifics of the Simpson family's financial situation in ways that are more precise than casual viewing suggests. Homer's salary exists in a specific range that can be estimated based on his job description, his union membership, and the economic context the show depicts. The family's expenses, when tallied, are tight against that salary. The numbers should not leave much margin. But the family's material life oscillates between barely making it and inexplicably fine in ways that feel contradictory if you expect a consistent economic state. They go on international vacations in some episodes and panic about car repair bills in others. This inconsistency is usually attributed to cartoon logic, but it is also a precisely accurate portrait of working-class financial volatility. For many American families in the period the show primarily depicts, financial stability was a function of which particular month you were in. Some months the numbers worked and a modest luxury was possible. Other months they did not, and the same family that went on vacation last summer was calculating which bills to pay first. The Simpsons' inconsistent financial depiction is the show accurately rendering the experience of financial precariousness rather than the appearance of it from the outside. The experience of financial precariousness is exactly as inconsistent as the show depicts. It lurches. It surprises in both directions. There is a practice in The Simpsons writing room that various writers have described in interviews over the years under different names, but that consistently refers to the same thing, which is the use of the show as a space to process real grievances through fictional form. Multiple episodes across the show's run were written primarily as vehicles for processing a specific professional or personal frustration. A writer who had been badly treated by a specific type of person or institution would write an episode whose central antagonist embodied that type, and the episode would proceed to thoroughly defeat and humiliate the antagonist in ways that were satisfying to the writer even when the satisfaction was not visible on the surface of the finished episode. This is not unusual among comedy writers, for whom the conversion of real anger into comic material is a professional skill as well as a psychological strategy. The specific quality of the Simpsons version is that the collective revision process had to validate the grievance in generalized form before the episode would pass through to production. Material that was too personally specific, too clearly aimed at a real individual in ways that raised ethical flags, was revised until the target was sufficiently abstract. But material whose emotional energy was genuinely about a universal type of frustration rather than a specific individual survived the revision process, and the episodes it produced carry that emotional energy in ways that give them a specific conviction that pure invention lacks. The best episodes in this category feel angry in a productive way. You can sense that something real is being processed, that the emotional investment in the story exceeds what pure invention would require, even if you cannot identify the specific incident that generated the investment. The anger sharpens the writing. The frustration produces specificity that makes the comic targets feel earned rather than arbitrary. The show's writing staff shared a set of literary and comedic influences that shape the show's output in specific ways, and those influences are visible in the texture of the episodes if you know what you are looking at. The influence of British comedy of the 1960s and 1970s, particularly the Monty Python group and their approach to absurdism and escalation, is present throughout the peak year's output in the form of a specific sensibility about how far to take a joke. Python comedy is famous for its willingness to push a premise past the point where most comedy would resolve, to extend the absurdity one more step beyond that until the joke has entered a territory where its own escalation has become the subject. The Simpsons joke that goes further than any reasonable expectation would predict, that earns its laugh through commitment to escalation rather than through a traditionally timed punchline, has Pythonesque DNA. Think of any sequence in the show where Homer is injured more comprehensively than the initial joke required. Think of the gorge fall, extending past the point of resolution into territory that is both funnier and stranger than the setup prepared you for. That instinct is inherited. The influence of American literary satire, particularly the tradition associated with novelists who used comic form to address serious social critique without subordinating the comedy to the critique, is present in the show's larger structural choices. The way Springfield functions as a microcosm for American social dysfunction, the way the show circles the same cultural problems from different angles across many episodes without ever landing on a resolution, the way it refuses to separate comedy from despair into separate registers, all of these reflect the influence of literary traditions that the show's highly educated writing staff knew well and consciously drew on. There is one more thing about the writer's room that is worth understanding, which is the specific dynamic of the room in the years just after the show's peak, when it was beginning to change in ways that were visible to people inside the production before they became visible to the audience. The departure of key writers from the room at various points in the late 1990s and early 2000s is well documented. What is less discussed is what specifically left with them, which is not simply talent but a specific collective knowledge that was distributed across the people in the room rather than residing in any individual. The cold read process, the character calibration process, the specific ways the room had learned to catch problems at draft stage before they reached production, these were practices that existed in the room as collective knowledge, maintained by the collective practice of the people who participated in them. When enough of those people left, the practices did not transfer completely to whoever replaced them. Not because the replacements were less capable writers, but because collective knowledge of this kind is not easily transmitted to people who did not participate in its original formation. The later seasons are written by smart and funny people. They produce episodes that are often individually effective. What they mostly lack is the continuous calibration that the peak seasons had, the ongoing correction of small deviations from character truth that the original collective revision process provided. The characters in the later seasons are sometimes recognizably themselves and sometimes slightly off in ways that are hard to specify precisely but easy to feel. The character voices drift. They come back. They drift again. The floor that the collective calibration provided is lower, and the floor shows. This is not a criticism of the people who made the later seasons. It is an observation about the specific nature of the quality the peak seasons had and why it was so difficult to maintain. What that writer's room produced was a genuine collective achievement, not reproducible by any individual member of it and not fully transferable to any successor group. It was a specific thing that existed at a specific time, and when the conditions that produced it changed, the thing changed with them. The hidden message encoded in the show's structure is this: quality of this kind is fragile and contextual. It requires specific conditions and specific practices and specific people in specific relationships with each other, and when those conditions change, the quality changes. The Simpsons at its peak is a document of what those specific conditions produced when they were all present simultaneously. That document is complete. Nothing that comes after adds to it or takes from it. It is what it is, which is one of the most fully realized bodies of work that the medium of American television comedy has ever produced. Section 3. The Dark Histories of Springfield's Background Characters. Springfield is populated by people whose lives the show has never told you about, and several of those untold lives are considerably darker than the show's comedy surface would suggest. The animators and writers gave the town's background residents enough consistent visual and behavioral detail that many of them carry implied histories visible only in the accumulated evidence of multiple appearances across many seasons. These are not random figures inserted to fill crowd scenes. They are specific people with specific qualities that repeat consistently enough to imply inner lives. And those inner lives, when you reconstruct them from the available evidence, tell stories about Springfield that the show's foreground never addresses. Doctor. Nick Riviera's comedy function, the bad doctor you go to when you cannot afford a real doctor, conceals a portrait of healthcare access failure that is specific and uncomfortable. Nick has some form of medical education. This is established by his functional, if wrong, knowledge of medical vocabulary, by his awareness of procedures even if his execution of them is alarming, by the presence of an office and equipment that represents a real financial investment in the infrastructure of medical practice. He is not a complete fraud in the sense of having invented credentials from nothing. He is something more troubling. A person who received medical education somewhere, in some institutional context, that provided enough exposure to medical knowledge to give him the vocabulary and the broad procedural familiarity without providing the depth and the oversight that safe practice requires. The question of where Nick trained and under what conditions is the dark question that the show's comedy never asks. Medical education of any kind requires years of sustained effort, examination processes, institutional credentialing. Even the least rigorous medical training programs that exist in the real world produce graduates with more functional medical knowledge than Nick's practice demonstrates. The explanation that most consistently fits the available evidence is that Nick trained in an institutional context that was itself inadequate, that provided the appearance of medical education without the substance, and that certified him as qualified without establishing that he was. He exists in Springfield because Springfield provides a market for his services. People who cannot afford qualified medical care, which in Springfield is a large proportion of the population, make do with what is available and affordable. Nick is available and affordable. His patient base is not choosing him because they are satisfied with his care. They are choosing him because he is the healthcare option that is accessible given their economic circumstances. This is a specific portrait of a real and ongoing problem in American healthcare access. The show depicts it as comedy because Nick is funny. But underneath the comedy is an accurate picture of what happens when healthcare systems fail to provide universal access. Chief Wiggum's corrupt incompetence is well established in the show, but the portrait is more layered than the corruption joke function suggests. Wiggum is corrupt. This is beyond dispute. He takes bribes. He uses the resources of his office for personal benefit. He fails to investigate crimes that powerful interests prefer not to have investigated, and he pursues crimes that those same interests want pursued with an enthusiasm that is inversely proportional to his enthusiasm for cases he neglects. The corruption is real and it is systematic, not incidental. But Wiggum is also genuinely not very intelligent, and the relationship between his genuine limitations and his strategic corruption is the interesting feature of the character. A police chief who fails to solve crimes committed by people with influence looks, from the outside, like a man who is simply not very good at his job, which Wiggum also is not. The genuine incompetence and the strategic incompetence overlap in ways that make attribution permanently uncertain, and the permanent uncertainty is the best possible protection for the corruption. You can never definitively prove that a specific failure was corrupt rather than simply incompetent, because the same person could have produced the same failure for either reason. This is a portrait of a specific and historically real mechanism through which institutional corruption sustains itself in small communities. The corrupt official who is also genuinely limited is almost impossible to hold accountable through normal mechanisms, because every accusation of corruption can be answered with an alternative explanation that is also true. The incompetence is not a cover story that Wiggum is cynically deploying. It is real. It just happens to provide excellent cover for what sits beneath it. His love for Ralph complicates the portrait in a way that the show handles with genuine care. Ralph's relationship to consensus reality is unusual in ways that the show depicts with consistent affection rather than pity. He processes the world through a framework that is genuinely different from anyone else's, producing observations that are confusing in ways that sometimes accidentally contain real insight. Wiggum's unconditional love for this unusual child is the one aspect of his character that is fully authentic, uncompromised, not available for purchase or strategic use. He loves his son. Everything else about Wiggum is negotiable. That one thing is not. The moral portrait this creates is more interesting than simple corruption would produce. A person who is wholly self-interested, who applies self-interest uniformly across every relationship and every decision, is a simpler and less human figure than a person who is mostly self-interested, but who has one genuine and uncalculated love in their life. Wiggum's love for Ralph is the crack in the self-interest that makes him recognizable rather than simply villainous, and it makes the self-interest more visible by contrast, because you can see that genuine warmth is possible for him, and he chooses not to extend it to his professional obligations. Professor Frink inhabits a position in Springfield's social ecology that becomes stranger and sadder the more carefully you examine it. Frink is genuinely brilliant. His technical knowledge is real in the specific sense that his inventions do things, usually not the intended things, but functionally non-trivial things, which implies that the underlying engineering is based on real understanding of the relevant domains. He speaks with a precision that requires actual knowledge of what he is describing. He is not performing intelligence without possessing it. Springfield cannot use Frink's intelligence in any sustained or productive way. His inventions appear in individual episodes, address the specific crisis that episode requires, and then disappear without being developed, refined, or integrated into Springfield's ongoing life. His knowledge is consulted in moments of acute need, and then returned to irrelevance when the need passes. He exists in the town as an emergency resource, called when something goes badly wrong in a way that requires his specific expertise, and then forgotten between emergencies. This is the experience of being significantly more capable than your environment in a way that the environment has no mechanism to use. The knowledge exists. The environment has no infrastructure for converting it into anything productive or sustained. The result is a permanent condition of mismatch between what you are and what the world around you is organized to need from you, which is one of the more specific and more common forms of loneliness. His social awkwardness, consistently played for comedy in the show, is the social consequence of this mismatch. He has spent years developing a set of capacities and a vocabulary for discussing them that most people in Springfield cannot meet him in. The shared vocabulary of ordinary social exchange is not the shared vocabulary that Frink has been building. He knows how to talk about things that most of his neighbors cannot follow, and he is not fluent in the small talk and social performance that allow people to connect without reference to their specific technical knowledge. The awkwardness is not a personality deficit independent of his situation. It is the social consequence of having invested very deeply in a domain that the surrounding community cannot engage with at the level where he lives in it. Sideshow Bob's trajectory across the show's run is, when viewed from a sufficient distance, one of the clearest structural tragedies in American animated television. The standard description is accurate as far as it goes. Brilliant, cultured, theatrical, obsessively determined to kill a 10-year-old. This is true, and it is also a description of someone whose entire adult life has been organized around a single destructive fixation at the expense of every other possible use of his considerable abilities. Bob's first criminal act, framing Krusty for armed robbery, is the crime of a person in a specific and genuinely constrained situation. He was highly educated, intellectually ambitious, culturally sophisticated, working as the sidekick of a less capable entertainer who held all the institutional power in their professional relationship. The institutional power was real. Krusty had the relationship with the audience. Bob had the competence. But competence without the audience relationship is not, in the entertainment industry, a path to the position you think you deserve. The crime Bob committed to escape this situation was serious. Framing someone for armed robbery causes real harm to the falsely accused person, and Krusty is not responsible for Bob's trapped situation in any simple sense. But the crime emerged from a set of circumstances that were genuinely unjust, and understanding that origin does not excuse the crime, while also not pretending the crime occurred in a vacuum. What destroyed the possibility of any recoverable trajectory from that starting point was the intervention of Bart Simpson, and specifically the publicity that surrounded that intervention. If the crime had been solved by an adult investigator through normal investigative processes, the resolution would have been significant but contained. Instead, it was solved by a child, which made it a story of a different kind, a story about the humiliation of a sophisticated and self-serious man by a 10-year-old. And that story had a quality that the normal crime and resolution story would not have had. The humiliation was public and total and attached itself permanently to how Bob's first major criminal act was understood by everyone who heard about it. Bob's obsession with Bart is not rational in the sense that killing Bart would not undo any of this. But it is psychologically coherent in the sense that human beings in genuine psychological pain often organize that pain around a single point that they identify as the cause, even when the causal logic is imperfect. Bart is the most visible and available target for pain that is really about the whole shape of Bob's life. What makes Bob worth spending time with as a character is the periodic visibility of the person he might have been without the obsession. He is a capable musician. He has genuine refinement and genuine aesthetic sensibility. He is capable of real connection when the murder planning is not active. These qualities are genuinely attractive in a person who is otherwise defined by something ugly, and they make the obsession more wasteful by contrast rather than more understandable. This person had the capacity for a real life. The obsession consumed the capacity, and the show has never stopped reminding you of that. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon's specific circumstances, examined carefully beyond the representation conversation that has appropriately surrounded the character in recent years, constitute one of the show's most accurate and least acknowledged portraits of a particular immigration experience. Apu holds an earned doctorate. He pursued graduate-level education at a significant level in a technical field, completing work that required sustained intellectual effort of a high order. He is one of the most formally educated characters in Springfield. His technical knowledge in his trained domain is genuine. The immigration and employment pathway that resulted in Apu running a convenience store involves a type of arrangement in which an immigration status is linked to a specific employment relationship with a specific employer. This type of arrangement exists in various forms in real American immigration practice and creates exactly the lock-in that Apu experiences. Leaving the job threatens the immigration status, and threatening the immigration status risks forfeiting the entire project that the immigration was undertaken to accomplish. Apu's extraordinary devotion to the store's operation, his willingness to work hours that would be unsustainable by any ordinary standard, his apparent inability to seriously consider alternatives, make sense in this context as something other than personality quirk. They are the behaviors of a person navigating a structural constraint that severely limits his options. The dedication is necessity wearing the appearance of devotion from outside. The store is his obligation before it is his identity, and the obligation is not one he created or chose freely. What is dark about Apu's situation is not anything specific to Apu. It is what his situation reveals about the structural mechanisms that shape immigrant professional experiences in America. Highly trained professionals who immigrate through employment-linked pathways often find their professional options significantly constrained by the terms of the arrangement that made immigration possible. Apu's situation is the cartoon version of a real and well-documented phenomenon, and the cartoon version is accurate enough in its structural outline to function as a portrait of something beyond his specific fictional case. Hans Moleman is the character who lives furthest outside the normal rules of Springfield, and his position outside those rules is the most overlooked running mystery in the show's history. Moleman dies constantly. Not in Halloween specials, not in dream sequences. In canonical regular episodes, Moleman dies, and then he appears in subsequent episodes completely fine, with no explanation and no acknowledgement of the previous death. The show has been doing this since the early seasons and has never stopped. By conservative estimate, he has died more times on screen than any other character in the history of American animation. The show treats this as background noise. He dies. He is fine. He dies again. The deaths are used as quick visual jokes, the show acknowledging that Moleman exists primarily to suffer. But within the logic of Springfield, within the framework of any coherent universe, a man who dies and repeatedly returns requires some explanation. He stated his age as 31 in one episode. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s. If he is telling the truth, and the show gives us no reason to assume he is lying, something aged him catastrophically between his actual age and his apparent age. Something took a man in his early 30s and compressed decades of physical deterioration into whatever time has passed since whatever happened to him happened. The radiation theory accommodates Moleman straightforwardly. His cellular structure has been so thoroughly altered by Springfield's contaminated environment that death for him is no longer terminal in the normal sense. The cellular reconstitution that the show depicts through his repeated recoveries is simply what happens to a body that has been fundamentally changed at a biological level by long-term radiation exposure. He does not survive his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Moleman's body ceases function completely and then returns to function, which is a different and more extreme version of the biological resilience the radiation theory suggests for Springfield's residents generally. The alternative reading is the one the coma theory provides, which is that Moleman is a background process in Homer's dreaming brain, a filler character that the dream maintains inconsistently because the dream does not care about him with enough precision to track whether he should currently be alive or dead. He appears when the dream needs him to populate a scene, and his deaths and returns are the dream's imprecise maintenance of a minor element. Moleman in this reading is not a person at all. He is a piece of furniture in Homer's unconscious, repeatedly broken and reassembled because the set requires it. Neither reading resolves the mystery fully. Both of them illuminate it in specific ways. The mystery remains open because the show chose to leave it open, which is itself a choice that tells you something about how the show understood Moleman's function. He is more useful as a recurring unresolved question than he would be as a solved one. Number. Section 4. The Treehouse of Horror Canon Problem. Every October, The Simpsons does something the rest of the year carefully avoids. It kills characters without consequence, abandons continuity without apology, and lets the show's universe behave in ways that the regular episodic format prevents. And then it returns to the regular Springfield as if nothing happened, and the regular format resumes, and nobody on either side of the screen is expected to reconcile the October events with the November continuity. This is the official framework. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are non-canon special events. What happens in them does not affect the universe the regular episodes inhabit. The dead are alive again the following week because the deaths were never, within the show's operational definition, real. The framework is real and it is useful. it is also in specific ways that are worth examining carefully, not quite accurate. The canonical wall between Treehouse of Horror and the main series is not as solid as the official framework implies, and the gaps in the wall are interesting for what they reveal about how the characters actually work. Burns is the most consistently porous element of the canon wall. The horror specials have repeatedly depicted Burns in proximity to death and supernatural forces in ways that connect to his main series characterization in specific rather than generic ways. The qualities that define horror episode Burns, his extreme proximity to non-existence, his apparent relationship with forces that operate outside normal biological constraint, his specific quality of existing at the boundary between the living and something else, are also visible in main series Burns, just muted rather than amplified. Reading the main series Burns after the horror episode Burns, you can see the horror qualities in the everyday characterization in ways you might not have noticed before the horror episodes made them explicit. The horror specials are functioning here not as separate events but as magnifying glasses held over qualities that were already present in the character, making visible what was there but not foregrounded. This is not the same as claiming canonical connection, but it suggests that the horror specials and the main series are drawing from the same characterization even when the events of one are not supposed to be available to the other. The same dynamic applies to Homer's relationship with death in the horror specials. Horror Homer dies often, in extravagant and detailed ways, and the ease with which he dies in the horror context illuminates something about the main series Homer's relationship with physical consequence. Main series Homer survives things that should kill him. Horror series Homer dies from things that should not kill him. Between these two extremes is the suggestion that Homer's relationship to mortality is fundamentally different from other characters, in ways that neither series can fully account for independently. Read together. They outline a character who exists in an unusual relationship to his own physical survival, one that neither the main series nor the horror specials can explain alone. The earliest Treehouse of Horror installments have a specific atmospheric quality that the later entries abandoned, and the abandonment is worth understanding as a deliberate shift rather than an accidental drift. The first three specials, from seasons 2, 3, and 4, are willing to let dread accumulate without immediately resolving it into comedy. They pace themselves differently from the aggressive joke density that characterized the show's regular episodes during the same period. They are comfortable with atmospheric quiet in a way that later entries and later seasons of the show generally were not. The second season special's adaptation of The Raven is the clearest case. The segment adapts the Poe poem with Homer in the narrator role and the Bart Crow providing the refrain, and the adaptation is faithful to the original in structure and in atmosphere. The humor comes from the juxtaposition of Homer's emotional flatness with Poe's portentous romanticism, but the juxtaposition does not eliminate the Poe atmosphere. It coexists with it. The creepiness of the poem is present alongside the comedy in a proportion that allows both to function simultaneously. This dual quality, where horror and comedy exist in the same space without one defeating the other, is the distinctive achievement of the earliest specials and the quality that later entries mostly abandoned. The shift happened gradually, and it tracked with broader changes in the show's comic sensibility during the middle seasons, when the pace accelerated and the atmospheric patience of the early years became less available. The horror specials became funnier and less atmospheric over time, which is not a straightforward decline, but is a real change in what the format was doing and what it could do. The Treehouse of Horror episodes create, when read as a cumulative body of work rather than as individual entertainments, a consistent picture of Springfield's theological universe that deserves serious attention. The afterlife, as depicted across horror specials written by different people in different seasons, is consistent enough in its broad features to suggest shared assumptions rather than coincidental similarity. Hell is administered. Heaven is governed by rules. The intermediate zones are bureaucratic. The force organizing the supernatural realm in the Simpsons universe does not appear to be primarily characterized by love or justice or transcendence. It appears to be primarily characterized by institutional process. This is funny, because the gap between the transcendent expectations people bring to death and the mundane bureaucratic reality they encounter on the other side is a reliable source of comedy. But it is also a genuine theological position, expressed through comedy, that deserves to be taken seriously as a statement about what kind of universe The Simpsons believes itself to inhabit. A universe governed by institutional process rather than by grace or arbitrary power, is a universe where outcomes depend on the correct application of rules, rather than on the will of any divine entity. The rules apply to supernatural beings as well as to humans. The devil cannot violate the terms of a properly executed contract. Heaven admits or rejects based on criteria that can be met or not met. The supernatural in the Simpsons universe is not above the law. It is the law's most powerful administrator. This is, among other things, a vision of cosmic fairness that is neither the optimistic version, where goodness is ultimately rewarded, nor the pessimistic version, where power operates without constraint. It is the middle version, where rules exist and are applied, but the rules themselves may not be just and the application may not be perfect, and the best anyone can do is understand the rules well enough to navigate them. This is the theology of a show whose writers were educated in institutions that taught them how institutions actually work. The Season 6 horror segment, often called The Shinning, is worth extended attention because it is the entry that most successfully does something with its source material that goes beyond parody. The segment adapts Kubrick's film with Homer in the role of the disintegrating caretaker, and the adaptation is accurate enough in its plot mechanics that anyone familiar with the film will follow the references without effort. The comedy comes from the application of Homer's specific emotional flatness to a character whose psychology, in the original, is genuinely complex and genuinely frightening. Homer's turn toward violence in this segment is not the product of suppressed creative frustration or the slow dissolution of a controlled personality under the pressure of isolation and supernatural influence. It is the product of not having television and beer. This substitution is funny for the obvious reason that it strips away the psychological complexity of the source material and replaces it with something much simpler. But it is also, when you sit with it, a comment on the source material. The original asks you to invest in a specific theory of violence. That creative frustration, combined with supernatural pressure and psychological predisposition, can transform an ordinary person into a murderous danger. The Simpsons parody asks implicitly whether that theory is doing the work the film claims for it, whether the psychological scaffolding is necessary, or whether the violence was always going to happen for much simpler reasons. This is not a criticism of the Kubrick film. It is a reading of it, embedded in a parody, that the parody format makes possible in a way that direct analysis would not. Parody gets to say things about its source material that direct critique cannot say with the same lightness. The horror specials at their best function exactly this way. They are not simply using genre material as a vehicle for Simpsons jokes. They are doing something with the genre material, examining it, reading it, asking questions about what it is doing and why. The best of them are genuine acts of criticism that happen to also be very funny. The recurring use of Homer as the figure who encounters the supernatural and emerges largely unchanged is one of the horror special's most consistent and most interesting choices. Homer meets the devil. Homer enters a dimension of pure mathematical abstraction. Homer is abducted by aliens. Homer encounters ancient Egyptian curses and vampire aristocrats and animated advertising mascots come to destructive life. And Homer, at the end of each encounter, is approximately as he was before it. The supernatural has no lasting purchase on him. This immunity to supernatural consequence is played as comedy, and it works as comedy, because the gap between the enormity of what Homer experiences and the shallowness of his response to it is inherently funny. But it also encodes something about Homer's character that the main series expresses differently. Homer's capacity to absorb extraordinary experience without being fundamentally changed by it is a quality the show depicts consistently across all formats. The horror specials make the extremity of this capacity visible by staging the most extreme possible experiences and watching Homer walk away from them. The question the horror specials do not answer, and that the main series also does not fully answer, is whether this capacity is a strength or a limitation. Homer cannot be lastingly changed by his encounters with the supernatural. He cannot be lastingly changed by many of the experiences the main series puts him through either. This consistency, this profound stability of self, is what makes him a reliable anchor for the show. It is also what limits the show's ability to tell certain kinds of stories with Homer at the center. A character who cannot be fundamentally changed is a character who cannot experience genuine narrative growth, and the horror specials, in their concentrated form, make this limitation very visible. The Treehouse of Horror episodes in their later seasons gradually shifted from horror-inflected comedy to comedy that used horror aesthetics as visual vocabulary without engaging with what horror is actually about. The monsters became funnier, the deaths became more elaborate, the parody targets became more contemporary, and the atmospheric dread that made the earliest specials worth revisiting long after their comedy had become familiar was mostly absent. This is not a failure of the later specials on their own terms. They accomplish what they set out to do, which is to be funny and strange and slightly more violent than the regular show. But they are doing something different from what the earliest entries did, and the difference is significant enough that comparing them as if they belong to the same tradition obscures more than it reveals. The earliest Treehouse of Horror episodes are horror comedies. The later ones are comedies that happen to air in October and happen to feature supernatural elements. The distinction sounds minor and is actually fairly important for understanding what either version is trying to do. The most honest account of what the Treehouse of Horror format provided to the show over its long run is this. It gave the writers a space to try things the regular format would not allow, and what they tried in that space tells you something real about what they wanted to try, but could not do elsewhere. The darkness that appears in the horror specials, the willingness to let characters stay dead, to let violence have weight, to let the supernatural be genuinely menacing rather than merely aesthetically strange, is the darkness that the regular show's comedy frame prevents. The horror specials are the pressure valve. They release what the main series accumulates but cannot express, and reading them alongside the main series, rather than separately as festive novelties, reveals what that accumulated pressure was made of. Section 5. The side characters with destroyed backstories. The term character destroyer is not official taxonomy. It is the fan community's description of a specific category of Simpsons episode whose defining characteristic is revealing information about a familiar character that permanently changes how that character can be watched. The information is not always simply dark. Sometimes it is complex in ways that enrich the character rather than merely complicating them. But the effect is consistent. A door opens that cannot be closed, and the character you knew before the episode is not quite the character you know afterward. Marge's gambling addiction episode is her character-destroying entry, and its destruction is subtle enough to be missed on first viewing. The episode depicts the progression of Marge's addiction with genuine psychological accuracy. The escalation from casual enjoyment to compulsive engagement follows the actual pattern of behavioral addiction rather than the simplified version that television usually deploys for clarity and dramatic convenience. The initial pleasure is recognizable as the specific pleasure of activities that engage a certain kind of psychological orientation. The clear feedback loops, the predictable reward structure, the total absorption that comes from activities whose rules are simple and whose feedback is immediate. These are qualities that specifically reward a compulsive personality, and Marge has a compulsive personality. This is what the episode reveals. Once you know this about Marge, her other behaviors read differently. Her extraordinary investment in the management of her household, her sustained effort to maintain control over the domestic environment, her willingness to devote enormous energy to organizing and regulating the life of her family, these are all behaviors consistent with a compulsive personality that has channeled itself into socially acceptable forms. The homemaking is not just love, though it is genuinely also love. It is the same psychological orientation, the same need for structured control and clear feedback that found its outlet in the slot machines, expressed through a channel that her social world values and rewards rather than pathologizes. This does not reduce Marge's care for her family to mere compulsion. Love and compulsion are not mutually exclusive, and in Marge's case they coexist in ways that are probably inseparable. But it adds a dimension to her character that was not visible before the episode and that cannot be made invisible after it. She is managing something, has always been managing something, that the gambling episode makes temporarily unmanageable and then recontains. The containment is not the resolution of the underlying condition. It is the condition returning to its managed state. The additional revelation the gambling episode encodes, one that requires reading between the lines of several episodes across multiple seasons, is the relationship between Marge's management impulse and Homer's consistent failure to be manageable. Homer is the aspect of Marge's domestic environment that does not yield to her organizing effort. Everything else in her household can be structured, scheduled, maintained within parameters she sets. Homer cannot. He overflows any container she builds. He generates chaos in places she has organized into order. He is the one element of her domestic world that her compulsive management instinct cannot fully address. This is why Marge stays with Homer despite the objective case against staying being fairly substantial. Not simply because she loves him, though she does, but because Homer is her most compelling unsolved problem, and a compulsive personality does not walk away from an unsolved problem. He is the one thing in her environment that keeps the management impulse perpetually active, perpetually engaged, perpetually needed. He is, in the darkest possible reading of their relationship, the substance she is most addicted to. Bart's character destruction is distributed across many episodes rather than concentrated in a single revelation, and its accumulation is one of the quieter, ongoing tragedies in the show's universe. The most foundational element is the evidence, available across multiple flashback contexts, that Bart was a genuinely different child before he encountered the school system. Young Bart in several flashback episodes is curious and imaginative and genuinely engaged with the world in ways that the older Bart's performance of disengagement has covered over, but not eliminated. The curiosity did not disappear. The engagement did not disappear. What changed was Bart's relationship to showing them, which the school system damaged by treating them as the wrong kind of curiosity and the wrong kind of engagement. Bart's specific intelligence is social and improvisational, and associative rather than sequential and analytical and measurable. He is excellent at reading people, at understanding what a social situation requires, and how to navigate it toward a desired outcome. He is quick to make connections across domains that the sequential, analytical approach to knowledge keeps separate. He is inventive in real time in ways that planned approaches to problem-solving are not. These are genuine and valuable forms of intelligence. They are just not the forms that conventional educational assessment is designed to recognize and reward. The school's failure to recognize Bart's intelligence was not malicious. It was the ordinary failure of a system designed to recognize one kind of intelligence encountering a child whose intelligence is organized differently. The response to the mismatch, which was to treat Bart as a problem child, a behavioral issue, a student who was not trying, did the specific damage to his relationship with learning and with institutions that is visible in the Bart the audience knows. The damage is real. The show depicts it as real, even within the comedy frame. The older Bart is a product of what happened to the younger Bart, and the younger Bart was a different person. What makes the Bart arc genuinely sad, rather than merely complicated, is the recurring evidence across many seasons that Bart knows the damage was done and cannot undo it. In specific episodes, usually the ones that pair Bart with an adult who sees him more clearly than most, you get glimpses of Bart operating at closer to his actual capacity, and those glimpses are immediately followed by his retreat into the disengagement that protects him from the particular pain of trying, and being told it is the wrong kind of trying. The retreat is not laziness. It is a learned protective strategy applied to a situation where the lesson was that genuine effort, applied in the wrong direction, produces punishment. Better to be the kid who did not try than the kid who tried wrong. Principal Skinner's destruction through the Armin Tamzarian revelation is the show's most controversial, character-destroying episode, and its controversy is partly appropriate and partly missing the point. The appropriate part of the controversy is that the revelation genuinely does destroy Skinner's character in the sense that it makes everything previously established about him rest on a fiction. His military service, depicted with emotional specificity in earlier episodes, belonged to someone else. His relationship with Agnes, which contained a complicated and often painful dynamic that felt psychologically true, was built on a stolen identity. His years of service to Springfield Elementary were performed by an imposter. The part of the controversy that misses the point is the assumption that the revelation, therefore, invalidates the character. What the episode is actually doing, when you read it carefully, is asking a philosophical question about identity that is genuinely interesting. Armin Tamzarian stepped into Seymour Skinner's life because he had no life of his own that was worth preserving. Over 2 decades, he lived as Skinner. He had Skinner's relationships. He performed Skinner's responsibilities. He was shaped by Skinner's circumstances. By the time the real Skinner returned, Tamzarian had become Skinner in every way that involves actual lived experience, even though he had never been Skinner in any biographical sense. The town's vote to choose the fake Skinner over the real one is easy to read as collective denial at its most absurd and explicit, but there is a more sympathetic reading. The town is choosing the person they actually know, the person they have lived alongside for 2 decades, over the biographical facts that would technically replace him with a stranger. The real Seymour Skinner is a war hero with an impressive biography and no relationship to anyone in Springfield. The fake Seymour Skinner is someone people have known and depended on and had complicated feelings about for 20 years. The choice between them is a choice between biographical legitimacy and experiential reality. Ned Flanders' backstory revelation is the one that requires the most extended attention because what it reveals is not a dark event, but a dark mechanism. And the dark mechanism is more unsettling than a dark event would be. The episode that delivers the revelation positions it as comedy, which is the right framing for a show about a neighborhood that refuses to take its own darkness seriously. Ned's relentless niceness is revealed to be not a natural temperament, but a psychological construction, the product of childhood behavioral modification conducted by a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive therapeutic intervention. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, being beatniks who did not believe in discipline, took him to a professional who resolved the problem by fundamentally restructuring his behavioral responses. Ned's kindness is not character. It is conditioning. Once you know this, everything about Ned reads differently. His patience with Homer is not saintly. It is pathological. He cannot express anger in response to Homer's provocations because his brain was wired to suppress anger at all costs. The suppression is not a choice he makes. It is the automatic response of a nervous system that was trained, years before Ned could have consented to the training, to redirect aggression away from expression. Homer's behavior toward Ned, which would be reasonably described as years of low-level sustained cruelty, does not produce in Ned the response it would produce in any person who had full access to their own emotional responses. It produces the conditioned alternative, which is forbearance, and forbearance performed in these conditions over this length of time is not virtue. It is suffering that has been trained to look like virtue. His faith is the framework that gives Ned's conditioned life a narrative structure it would otherwise lack. If you have been trained to suppress your authentic emotional responses and to channel everything into socially appropriate expressions of goodness, you need a story that explains why this is the right way to be, why the suppression is not suppression but devotion, why the conditioning is not a cage but a calling. Faith provides that story. It gives the conditioned behavior a purpose larger than the psychological history that produced it. Whether Ned's faith is genuine in some deeper sense beyond its function as a narrative framework is a question the show does not resolve, and the irresolution is appropriate. From the outside, genuine faith and functional faith are not distinguishable. Kent Brockman's arc across the series is the most gradually developed character destruction in the show's history. In his earliest appearances, Brockman has the specific quality of a professional who once held genuine ambitions and who has reached a real level of achievement while accommodating the compromises that the specific form of his achievement required. Local television news is a real professional achievement. It is also a specific professional context with specific limitations and specific compromise requirements that are structural rather than personal, built into the economics and the culture of local television, rather than being choices that any individual in the field makes freely. The hollowing out happens gradually. Each season's Brockman is a small step further from the professional commitment and a small step closer to the pure performance of the journalistic persona without the journalistic substance behind it. He becomes more willing to endorse whichever position seems advantageous at the moment, more susceptible to having his coverage shaped by whoever has enough money or status to warrant deference, more focused on the drama of a story than its informational content, more comfortable saying things that are not quite true if they are sufficiently compelling. The insect overlord's moment, his famous on-air announcement welcoming the new dominant species to Earth, is often treated as a pure comedy beat. In the context of the character's arc, it is the logical endpoint of a long process. This is a man who has been choosing the path of least resistance whenever professional principle and institutional convenience conflicted, endorsing whoever appears to be winning, without waiting to evaluate what winning means for the people he is supposed to serve, is entirely consistent with the pattern. The stakes are higher in that moment and the absurdity is more visible, but the underlying choice is the same one he has been making for years. Number. Section 6. The Springfield Economy and Why Nothing Adds Up. Springfield's economy does not work, and the ways in which it does not work are specific and interesting rather than simply arbitrary. The town's productive base is thin relative to the population and infrastructure the show depicts. The nuclear power plant is the primary engine of actual production, generating electricity that is presumably sold to a regional market and generating revenue for Burns as its owner. Beyond the plant, the visible economy of Springfield is almost entirely service sector. Bars, restaurants, stores, healthcare providers, law enforcement, education, legal services, waste management. These are businesses and institutions that circulate money within the local economy. They do not import money from outside it. An economy that does not export goods or services cannot sustain itself over time. Money flows out of any local economy through purchases that the local market cannot supply. And without corresponding inflows from exports, the local money supply gradually depletes. Springfield should be becoming progressively poorer unless there is an export sector the show has simply never depicted. The show maintains Springfield's economic life at a roughly stable level, without resolving this structural problem, which is one of the many ways in which Springfield operates outside the rules that govern real American communities. The charitable reading is that Springfield's economy is approximately stable because Burns's plant provides enough economic activity, direct employment, local procurement, and indirect economic effects through worker spending that it functions as a sufficient economic anchor for the town's size. This reading requires accepting that the plant's contribution to the local economy is large enough to offset the absence of any other meaningful export sector, which is possible but requires a lot of the available assumptions. The less charitable reading is that Springfield is in slow economic decline, a decline masked by the show's tendency to depict economic hardship in individual family contexts while maintaining the town's infrastructure and institutional life at a stable level. The individual families struggle. The town's aggregate economy somehow functions. The gap between these two levels of economic description is the gap the show never closes, because closing it would require either acknowledging that individual struggle is compatible with aggregate stability, which would make the show more explicitly about class dynamics than it usually is, or acknowledging that the aggregate is also in decline, which would change the texture of Springfield from a going concern to a failing one. Homer's salary and the family's financial situation provide the most specific economic data the show offers, and they are worth examining carefully, because they are more internally interesting than the broad impossibility of the Springfield economy. Homer is a unionized industrial worker at a nuclear facility. In the real American labor market of the period the show primarily depicts, this job description places him in a specific wage range: decent, sufficient for a modest family life with careful management, but not sufficient for the material lifestyle the show sometimes depicts the family enjoying. The job has union protection and probably reasonable benefits, which affects the actual economic picture somewhat, but the salary itself is not affluent by any measure. The family's material life oscillates between genuine precariousness and apparent comfort in ways that seem contradictory if you expect a consistent economic state. They go on international vacations in some episodes and panic about car repair bills in others. A pool is installed, and then the pool disappears. A new car appears, and the question of how they afforded it is not addressed. This inconsistency is usually attributed to cartoon logic, but it is also a precisely accurate portrait of working-class financial volatility. For many American families in the period the show primarily depicts, financial stability was a function of which particular month you were in. The Simpsons' inconsistent financial depiction is the show accurately rendering the experience of financial precariousness rather than the appearance of it from the outside. The experience of financial precariousness is exactly as inconsistent as the show depicts. It lurches. It surprises in both directions. The vacation is real, and so is the bill panic, and both exist in the same household because the margin is thin enough that small changes in either direction produce large changes in the experience of financial life. Homer's specific vulnerability to financial catastrophe is worth noting. He is not financially reckless in a calculating way. He is financially reckless in an impulsive way, the way that people are financially reckless when their relationship to money is primarily emotional rather than strategic. Money, when it is present, is something to be spent on pleasurable things, because the experience of spending it on pleasurable things is better than the experience of saving it against an uncertain future. This is not an irrational approach to money from the perspective of someone who has reason to be uncertain about whether the future will arrive in a form where the savings will be accessible or useful. It is the approach to money of someone who has internalized, correctly or incorrectly, that the future is not a reliable destination. Burns's wealth is depicted with more specific accuracy than is usually recognized. The show understands that extreme wealth creates a fundamentally different relationship to economic reality, not simply a more comfortable version of ordinary economic life. Burns has lost the ability to relate to ordinary financial transactions because his scalar sense of money is calibrated to a completely different reference point. A sum that would be significant to any other Springfield resident is, to Burns, below the threshold of financial relevance. He cannot relate to it as a meaningful quantity because the denomination is too small to register against his reference scale. This is not how wealthy people are usually depicted in American media. The usual portrayal of wealth treats it as having more of what everyone has, a quantitative rather than qualitative difference. Burns illustrates the qualitative difference. That wealth at sufficient scale stops being a resource to be managed and becomes a medium in which you exist, like water rather than money in any familiar sense. Burns's compulsive accumulation and retention of wealth, his inability to release it voluntarily toward anyone else, is a pathology rather than a strategy. He has so much that he could not spend it all if he tried. The fear of any of it leaving his possession is not rational in economic terms. It is emotional, which means its origins are psychological rather than financial, rooted in whatever in Burns's history made the retention of power feel existentially necessary rather than merely desirable. The show depicts this with one of its most precisely observed details: Burns's inability to recognize small monetary quantities as real. He will spend enormous effort and elaborate planning to acquire a penny or a sandwich that someone else bought, not because he needs either, but because the acquisition reflex operates independently of the size of the object being acquired. The acquisition is the point. What is acquired is secondary to the fact of having acquired it. This is a portrait of a compulsion that has outlasted any functional relationship to its original purpose, which in Burns's case was presumably accumulating resources sufficient for survival and comfort at some point in his very distant past. The function is gone. The compulsion remains, enormous and purposeless and completely controlling. The Quickie Mart's economics are the clearest window into how the Springfield service economy functions for the individual proprietors who operate within it. Apu works extraordinary hours. This is established clearly and repeatedly across the show's run. The store is open essentially all the time, and Apu is present for essentially all of those hours, often sleeping briefly behind the counter rather than closing. The standard reading of this is dedication. The immigrant work ethic made cartoonishly extreme for comic effect. The economic reading is different. The Quick E-Mart franchise structure, to the extent the show depicts it, involves ongoing fees paid to the franchisor in exchange for the right to operate the brand. In thin-margin businesses like convenience retail, where the profit on individual transactions is small and volume is the primary lever of profitability, covering both the franchise fees and the operating costs and generating a personal income requires very high volume, which requires very long operating hours, which requires either expensive additional staff or owner-operator labor during all operating hours. Apu's extraordinary hours are not primarily a cultural or characterological fact. They are an economic fact. The business structure requires those hours to function profitably. What reads as exceptional dedication is the output of an economic model that leaves its operator no choice about the hours if the business is to survive. This is an accurate portrait of how franchise economics work for small operators in thin-margin retail, and the show depicts it accurately while framing it entirely as comedy and never examining it as economics. Moe's Tavern is the most economically implausible business in Springfield, and it has been failing in plain sight for the entire run of the show. The customer base is small and consistent. The same small group of alcoholics drinks at Moe's on a reliable schedule. They do not bring new customers. They do not spend beyond their apparent means. The bar does not have a food program or entertainment offerings or any ancillary revenue stream that would expand its economic base beyond the alcoholism of a handful of regular patrons. The economics of this situation are straightforward and dire. A bar with this customer profile cannot cover commercial rent, liquor license fees, inventory costs, and the overhead of operating a licensed establishment in any real market. Moe is aware of this. The show depicts his awareness of it repeatedly, through his periodic attempts to rebrand the bar, to attract new customer demographics, to introduce food service or entertainment, all of which fail. He knows the bar is not viable as it currently operates. He has tried to change it. He cannot. The regular patrons resist change. The new customer demographics he targets do not materialize or do not stay. And Mo returns each time to the failing status quo because it is at least a familiar failing. The dark reading of Mo's persistent operation is that he is not running a business in any meaningful commercial sense. He is operating a social institution, a space whose economic viability is secondary to its function as a place where certain people can be and certain relationships can be maintained. The bar persists not because it generates sufficient revenue, but because its continued existence serves needs that its patrons cannot meet elsewhere. Mo knows this, and he stays because the knowledge that he is necessary, that without the bar certain people would have nowhere to go, is its own form of compensation, not financial compensation. The other kind. Number. Section 7. Lost pilots, unmade episodes, and abandoned storylines. The show that exists across 36 seasons is not the only show that was ever planned. There is a parallel history of The Simpsons that never aired, a collection of episodes and character arcs and creative directions that reached various stages of development before being abandoned. And understanding what was abandoned illuminates what was kept in ways that the kept material alone cannot. The original show was substantially darker than what reached broadcast. Groening's earliest detailed pitch described a family whose dysfunction was more extreme than the broadcast version. Homer's negligence was more genuinely alarming than the lovable bumbler characterization the show developed. The children were more anarchic in ways that crossed from comedy into something that would have been harder to sustain audience sympathy for over many seasons. The satirical targets were sharper and less affectionate. The critique of working-class American life less warm and more pointed. The network's development process shaped this toward the tone of the early broadcast seasons through negotiations that involved both artistic and commercial considerations. The resulting Homer is softer and more sympathetic than the original conception, and this is probably the right choice for a character who needs to anchor audience investment across hundreds of episodes. A Homer who was genuinely alarming rather than endearingly incompetent would be a much harder character to stay with over decades. But the original conception existed, and the distance between it and the broadcast version reveals something about what the show was willing to be before institutional constraints shaped it into something more broadly acceptable. The original show would have been angrier. The broadcast show is warmer, which is not a description of a diminishment so much as a description of a different choice made under different pressures. The abandoned Lisa trajectory is the unmade storyline that most clearly represents a road not taken that would have been significant. Across several seasons in the mid to late 1990s, multiple episodes were building a portrait of Lisa's situation in Springfield that was accumulating toward a crisis. The episodes were examining her isolation with increasing precision, looking at the specific costs of being the most intellectually capable person in an environment that systematically undervalues that kind of capability. They seemed to be building toward a genuine reckoning with whether Lisa could remain in Springfield, whether the love of her family and the familiarity of her home were sufficient anchors for someone whose needs exceeded what her environment could provide. Neither of the conclusions that trajectory was pointing toward was ever made. The show stepped away from the acute crisis and settled into the chronic condition, depicting Lisa's isolation as a permanent managed state rather than a developing problem approaching resolution. The writers were honest, in DVD commentaries and interviews, about why the show cannot allow Lisa to leave, which the format prevents, and cannot allow her a resolution within Springfield that would fundamentally change the character's function as the show's conscience and emotional center. This is an honest account of the structural constraints. It is also a choice that costs something artistically. The Lisa approaching a genuine reckoning is a more interesting character than the Lisa who has adjusted to permanent reduced circumstances. The show chose sustainability over intensity, which is the right choice for long-form television and the less interesting choice for the most truthful version of that character's story. Lisa's potential arc, the one the show began assembling and then declined to complete, would have been one of the most emotionally sophisticated pieces of work that American animated television has ever attempted. That it exists only in fragments, in the accumulated evidence of episodes that were building towards something they never reached, makes it both more interesting and more poignant than a completed arc would be. The Sideshow Bob resolution is the unmade ending whose absence is most felt across the show's accumulated history. Bob has been recurrent for most of the show's run, each appearance adding to the portrait of a character who is more than a villain, who has qualities that made a different life possible, and that are now devoted entirely to an obsession that consumes them. This accumulation should have been building towards something. Long-running antagonist dynamics in serialized storytelling usually either resolve through the antagonist's transformation or through some form of genuine relationship change that shifts the dynamic permanently. The writers apparently wanted this too. Several possible resolutions were discussed in the writing room over the years. One involved Bob genuinely transforming his intelligence towards something constructive, a change that various episodes gestured toward by showing his genuine capabilities in non-murder planning contexts. Another involved a real reckoning between Bob and Bart in which the history between them was examined with enough seriousness to change something real. Both were declined. Bob's recurring utility as an antagonist was judged more valuable than the narrative completeness of resolving his arc. This is an understandable commercial decision and a somewhat heartbreaking artistic one, because the character who continues to appear after the resolution was declined is one whose story was indefinitely deferred in favor of commercial usefulness. The deferral is visible in the accumulated episodes in a way that the resolution would not be, because the resolution would have closed the door and the ongoing deferral keeps it conspicuously ajar. There are several episodes that were written, went through various stages of development, and were abandoned at points before production was complete. The reasons vary. Some were abandoned because the story did not work well enough to justify the investment of completing it. Some were abandoned because the story worked too well in directions that created problems with standards and practices, or with nervous executives, or with the network's sense of what the show was supposed to be doing. A few were abandoned because of events in the real world that made the subject matter too sensitive to air in the form in which it had been written. The category of abandoned episodes that involve the show going somewhere uncomfortable and being pulled back is the most interesting category, because it reveals the pressure points where the show's ambitions exceeded what the institutional context would support. These episodes exist, in their incomplete forms, as evidence of what the show wanted to do and of the forces that shaped what the show was allowed to do. The gap between them is a map of the show's institutional constraints, drawn by the shape of what was refused. Several writers have described, in various retrospective contexts, pitches and early drafts for episodes that examined the Burns-Springfield relationship with more directness than any episode that actually aired. Versions in which the show engaged explicitly with what Burns has done to the town and to its residents, not through implication and background detail as the existing episodes do, but through a story that placed the accountability question at the center. These versions did not make it to air. The usual explanation is that making Burns directly accountable, making the critique explicit, would damage the character's usefulness as a recurring antagonist. A Burns who has been held genuinely responsible for something cannot simply return to the role of eccentric villain in the next episode without the accountability weighing on the story in ways that would be dramatically complicated to manage. This explanation is accurate as far as it goes. It is also, at a certain level, an explanation for why the show chose sustainable character dynamics over honest reckoning with what its own premises implied. Springfield's contamination is real within the show's universe. Burns's responsibility for it is real. The show's choice to keep that responsibility permanently unresolved, to keep the reckoning always impending and never arriving, is a choice that serves the show's commercial interests and compromises its artistic ones. The abandoned episodes that approach the reckoning are the evidence of what was compromised. There is a category of unmade content that exists between episodes and pilots, in a form that television production history rarely discusses clearly, which is the extended story arc that was sketched out across multiple future seasons, and then abandoned when the creative team changed and the incoming team had different priorities or different views of where the characters should go. The Simpsons has had several of these across its run. The most clearly documented involve character relationships that were being slowly developed across several seasons, with specific scenes and moments planted in individual episodes as setup for payoffs that were planned for later seasons. When the creative team changed, the incoming team either did not know about the planned payoffs or did not share the outgoing team's interest in them, and the setup that had been planted remained in the aired episodes without the payoff that would have given it retrospective meaning. The result is that certain episodes in the show's middle seasons contain moments that feel like setup but never pay off, beats that have the specific weight of something planted for a purpose, but whose purpose was abandoned before it could be fulfilled. These moments are legible as orphaned setup if you know what to look for, and once you know what to look for, you notice them fairly regularly in episodes from certain periods of the show's history. They are the traces of a show that was planning a future that the future of the production did not deliver. Number. Section 8. The real people behind Springfield's characters. The fictional Springfield is inhabited by characters constructed from real observations, real relationships, real experiences processed through the medium of animation. Understanding those constructions illuminates both the characters and the real material they were built from. The Groening family connection goes further than the naming convention that everyone knows. The fact that Homer, Marge, Lisa, and Maggie are all names from Matt Groening's actual family. That connection is real and well documented, and not the interesting part. The interesting part is what the actual family dynamics contributed to the emotional texture of the characters. The way the relationships and tensions of a specific real family became the raw material for a fictional family that has outlasted any realistic expectation of longevity. Homer J. Groening, Matt's father, was a filmmaker and humorist whose creative life involved storytelling in forms that, while different from television animation, occupied the same broad territory as the show his son created. He was intelligent, creative, opinionated, and possessed of qualities that made him both an interesting presence and a complicated parent. He was also someone whose potential was not fully realized in his own professional life, whose intelligence and creativity did not produce the kind of recognition and reach that his son's work eventually achieved. The cartoon Homer carries this. Homer Simpson's complicated relationship with his own intelligence, the way he is both capable of more than he usually produces and genuinely damaged in ways that limit what he can produce, reflects something about the experience of being the son of a smart and creative man whose potential was not fully realized. The specific framing the show uses, radiation and a crayon, provides a cartoon explanation for cognitive limitation that in the real world takes other forms. But the underlying experience of existing below your potential level, of having something in you that circumstances prevent from being fully available, is biographical rather than purely invented. The mothers in The Simpsons, both Marge and Mona and Agnes, and the other maternal figures the show has developed, collectively carry more biographical weight than is usually discussed. Groening has spoken about his own mother with a warmth and specificity that suggests she was a significant influence on his creative sensibility. And Marge, in her earliest and most carefully characterized seasons, has qualities that feel like they come from close observation of a specific person rather than from type. The patience, the specific texture of her worry, the way she maintains her emotional equilibrium by projecting optimism that she does not entirely feel, these are qualities you recognize from close observation rather than from cultural template. Agnes Skinner is a more interesting creation than her comedy function as the overbearing mother suggests, because the show has given her enough backstory detail across multiple episodes to construct a picture of a life that the comedy does not contain. She is old enough that her formative years predated the Second World War. The social and economic world she grew up in was genuinely different from Springfield's present in ways that the show occasionally acknowledges. Her relationship with her son, her specific way of dominating without appearing to dominate, her emotional unavailability combined with her total unwillingness to let her son be emotionally available to anyone else, are patterns with recognizable real-world antecedents in a specific generational and cultural context. The villain figures in The Simpsons draw on real antecedents in ways that are more specific than the generic critique of wealth and power would suggest. Burns is a composite whose elements are drawn from several different sources in American industrial and political history, but he is not a pure composite in the sense of having been assembled from historical types without a specific organizing principle. The organizing principle is the specific attitude toward human costs that characterized a particular strain of industrial management philosophy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an attitude that understood the well-being of workers and communities as a cost to be minimized rather than a value to be protected, and that operated within a legal and regulatory framework that largely supported this understanding. Burns embodies this philosophy with a completeness and a self-awareness that its real historical practitioners mostly did not have. Historical industrialists of the Gilded Age generally did not think of themselves as people who disregarded human costs. They had ideological frameworks, social Darwinian or providential or simply economic, that explained why the disregard was appropriate or inevitable or beneficial in the long run. Burns lacks most of these rationalizations. He knows what his plant does to Springfield. He knows what his decisions cost the people who live downstream of those decisions. He continues because the costs are borne by other people and the benefits accrue to him, and this honest accounting is more disturbing than any ideological rationalization would be. Lisa is not one person. She is a composite of several types of experience that the show's writing staff recognized from their own histories. The type she most fully embodies is the gifted child whose specific kind of intelligence is consistently misread by the educational and social systems they inhabit. This is extraordinarily common in the specific population of people who become comedy writers, because comedy writing requires a form of intelligence that is distinct from, and often in tension with, the forms that conventional educational systems measure and reward. Many people in the Simpsons writing room during its peak years had been exactly this child, perceptive in ways their environments could not accommodate, caring about things that the communities around them did not care about in the same way, experiencing a specific loneliness that is the product of minds that are not meeting the minds around them at the level where they live. Lisa is their composite self-portrait from childhood. The emotional accuracy of her characterization, the specific quality of her isolation, reflects lived experience rather than research. The show did not need to investigate what it feels like to be a gifted child in an unsympathetic environment. It was written by people who could draw from memory. This is why Lisa works as a character across so many different writers and so many different episodes despite the collective revision process. The collective revision process passes material that resonates with the collective, and the experience of being Lisa is one that enough people in that collective shared that they could maintain the emotional truth of the portrait through the revision continuously across every season. Ned Flanders' biographical origins involve a more complicated portrait of genuine goodness than the religious neighbor function suggests, and the complications are biographical as well as characterological. Various interviews with the show's early writers suggest that Ned was built partly from observation of actual people in actual communities who maintained a similar quality of deliberate and sustained goodness in the face of circumstances that would have produced bitterness or resentment in most people. The specific quality the show was interested in was not saintliness in the sense of natural freedom from negative impulse, but goodness as a practice, as something maintained through effort and faith, and a specific relationship to difficulty that treats difficulty as something to be metabolized rather than accumulated as grievance. The revelation that Ned's goodness is conditioned rather than natural is, in this biographical context, not a deconstruction of the character type but a deepening of it. Real people who maintain goodness as a practice are also not doing it from a position of natural freedom from negative impulse. They are doing it through something, through faith or commitment or community, or a practiced return to values that are genuinely held, even when the emotions that accompany their expression have to be worked for. The conditioning in Ned's backstory is the show's cartoon version of this, and its specificity, its extremity, is the exaggeration that makes the underlying truth visible. Krusty the Clown is the character who carries the most directly autobiographical content from the Jewish American entertainment tradition, and he carries it in ways that are both affectionate and genuinely sad. Krusty is a talented performer. This is not in question. His instincts as an entertainer, visible in moments when he is genuinely engaged rather than simply present, are real and considerable. He knows what he is doing when he is doing it at full capacity. The problem is that full capacity is rarely available to him, because full capacity requires a level of investment in the work that the accumulated disappointments and compromises and poor decisions of his professional life have made increasingly difficult to summon. He is performing on residual talent and professional muscle memory, the craft sustaining the performance after the investment has largely departed. This is a portrait drawn from observation of real performers in real entertainment industries, and the Simpsons writing staff had enough exposure to that world to have seen the pattern in actual people. The trajectory from genuine talent and genuine investment to professional reflex and residual craft is well documented in comedy specifically, where the demands of the form often exhaust the practitioners faster and more completely than they anticipate. Krusty is what that trajectory looks like when the camera is still running, when the performer has outlasted their genuine engagement with the work but the institutional context that defined them has not changed around them. Number. Section 9. Death, Grief, and the Darkness. the comedy cannot contain. The Simpsons is a comedy, but it has produced, across its long run, some of the most genuinely affecting depictions of death and grief in American television, comedy or otherwise. These moments are not frequent, and they are usually embedded in comedy that makes them accessible without making them easy. But they are real, and they accumulate into something that deserves examination on its own terms. Maud Flanders' death is the most structurally significant death the show has produced, and the one whose circumstances reveal the most about the relationship between production realities and creative outcomes. Maud died because the actress who voiced her left the show over a compensation dispute. The death was a production necessity, not a creative choice. This is the honest account of how it happened, and it does not reflect well on the circumstances. Character deaths driven by contract disputes rather than narrative logic are a real and recurring phenomenon in television, and they rarely produce the show's best work. But the treatment of Ned's grief in the aftermath of Maud's death was handled with genuine seriousness and sustained care that the circumstances of the death's origin did not require and did not predict. The show examined what it looks like for a person whose entire self-definition was organized around a relationship to lose that relationship, not in a single episode that then reset, but across multiple episodes over a sustained period. The grief was not resolved quickly. It was not used primarily as a source of comedy. It was depicted as what it is, a prolonged and complicated process that changes the person experiencing it in ways that cannot be fully undone. Ned without Maud is a different Ned, not just bereaved, structurally changed. The show allowed this, did not pull back from it, and the result is one of the most honest portrayals of spousal grief in American television comedy, produced by accident from circumstances that were not designed to produce honesty. This is one of the stranger things about the show's relationship with its best emotional content. Some of it arrived through constraint rather than intention, and the constraint produced a quality that pure intention might not have generated. The episode about Homer potentially dying from a poisoned blowfish is the show's most sustained exercise in imagining Homer's death, and it works because of how seriously it takes the exercise. Homer believes he has 24 hours to live. The episode spends those 24 hours with him, watching what he chooses to do with them, and what he chooses reveals the show's understanding of what Homer actually is, underneath the comedy. He knows what matters. He knows who he loves. He knows what he has done badly and what he has done well. The 24 hours gives him permission to act on this knowledge in ways the regular format does not permit. He spends time with his father, which is uncomfortable and unresolved, because the relationship with his father is uncomfortable and unresolved. He makes sure Bart knows how to shave, which is a mundane, specific detail of fatherly knowledge transfer that is both funny and completely devastating in context. He listens to Lisa play. He lies in bed with Marge and does not sleep. He does the work of saying goodbye to his life with the specific gravity that the show usually prevents, because the show's format requires that no goodbye be permanent. He does not die. The blowfish was prepared correctly and Homer was fine. But the episode earns its place in the show's history, not through its ending, but through the 24 hours that precede it. Because those hours allow you to see Homer clearly in a way the regular comedy format makes difficult. He is not complicated. He is simple, in the way that people who know what they love are simple. He loves his family. He loves his life. The comedy has always been built on this, but it takes the threat of death to make it fully visible. The show's handling of Homer's mother Mona's death is the clearest evidence of what the show is capable of when it commits to emotional honesty without comedy as a buffer. The scene in which Homer sits with his dying mother and holds her hand and watches her leave is played entirely without jokes, without deflection, without the comedy frame arriving to make the scene more manageable. It is simply what it is. A man and his mother and the weight of many lost years pressing down on both of them in a quiet room. The scene works because it was earned. The Mona storyline accumulated real emotional capital across multiple seasons, developing the specific nature of what Homer lost and what he found when he finally found her. By the time of her death, the audience has enough understanding of the relationship's particular history to feel the final loss as something specific rather than generic. The years Mona spent underground, the years Homer spent believing she was dead, the specific shape of what they had when they finally had anything at all, the quality that the reunion carried and the quality that her final departure had, all of this is available to give the death scene its weight. What Homer achieves in that room is not resolution in any clean sense. He does not emerge with a clear understanding of his own psychology or the full account of what her absence cost him. What he achieves is presence, the experience of being there at the end of someone's life, holding their hand, and finding that presence adequate to the moment, that there was nothing more that needed to be done and what was done was enough. This is the show's most honest statement about grief. Not that it resolves, not that it teaches, not that it transforms, but that presence at the right moment, even imperfect presence, even presence that arrives too late and stays too short, is something. It is not nothing, it counts. The Simpsons has handled the death of recurring characters with a range of approaches that reveals the show's evolving relationship to consequence over its long run. In the early seasons, death was rare enough in the main series that when it appeared it registered as genuinely significant. The show understood consequence. It allowed events to have weight beyond the episode in which they occurred. Characters who had lost something in one episode carried that loss into subsequent episodes in ways that affected their behavior and their relationships. The Springfield of the early seasons was a world where things that happened continued to matter. The middle seasons developed a more complicated relationship to consequence, one that acknowledged the tension between the emotional honesty the show was capable of and the format requirements of an episodic comedy that needed to reset to a recognizable baseline at the end of each episode. The grief and loss of the middle seasons is real within the episodes that contain it and somewhat less present in the episodes that follow. Not because the show was careless about continuity, but because the format imposed a kind of managed amnesia that the show negotiated more or less successfully, depending on the specific circumstances. The later seasons largely resolved this tension by reducing the weight of consequence as a category. Events happen and are processed and then filed rather than carried. Characters experience things and return to their established characterization, with the experience incorporated but not fundamentally transformative. This is the episodic format's natural tendency, and the later seasons follow it more completely than the earlier ones, which had more investment in the costs of resisting it. What this means for the show's relationship to death specifically is that deaths in the later seasons tend to produce grief that is appropriate to the episode containing it and then manageable in the episodes that follow. The show has developed a way of honoring loss within the format's constraints that does not produce the kind of sustained alteration of character that the Ned Flanders arc produced. It is a more efficient but less truthful approach to what death does to people, which is to say that it is exactly the kind of compromise that long-form television makes to maintain its format, and that costs something real in exchange. The Simpsons has also depicted suicide and suicidal ideation across its long run, in contexts that the comedy frame makes complicated to evaluate. The moments in which characters have been depicted in states of acute despair, in which the show has acknowledged that certain Springfield residents have considered ending their lives, are handled with enough care to be notable, but with enough comedy to be protected from the full weight of what they are depicting. Homer has been in states that the show depicts as despairing without depicting as suicidal, mostly, but the edge of those states is visible in certain episodes, and the comedy that surrounds them does not entirely prevent the edge from registering. Moe's relationship to his own continued existence has been a recurring dark thread in the show for many seasons, depicted with a consistency and a specificity that suggests the writers understood they were dealing with something real rather than simply a character quirk available for comic use. The show has used this dark thread for comedy regularly and handled it with varying degrees of care depending on the specific episode, the specific writer, and what the story required. The honest account of The Simpsons' relationship to darkness in all its forms, including death and grief and despair, is that the show has been more willing to engage with these subjects than its comedy format would suggest, and less willing to engage with them than its best episodes demonstrate is possible. It has been inconsistent in ways that reflect the inconsistency of any large collaborative, creative project managed across decades, with changing personnel and changing institutional pressures. The best of what it has done in this territory is genuinely excellent. The average of what it has done is something less than that, but still more than most American comedy television manages. And the worst of what it has done is the comedy that uses darkness as texture without engaging with what the darkness is about, which is also real but is the cost of volume rather than a consistent characterological failure. Number. Section 10. The religious and philosophical undercurrent running through every season. The Simpsons has engaged with questions of faith, divine presence, moral obligation, and the structure of existence more consistently and more seriously than almost any other American comedy television series. This engagement is woven into the show's fabric without being labeled, visible in the specifics of character and situation rather than in explicit discussion. God exists literally in the Simpsons universe. This is not a metaphor. God has appeared as a character with specific physical characteristics, a specific personality, a specific way of engaging with the world. He is accessible to certain Springfield residents under certain conditions. He is not an abstraction. He is a person, or something like a person, with opinions and a will and a history of specific interactions with the world he created. The show has committed to this literalism with enough consistency across many seasons that it cannot be dismissed as isolated joke. The theological universe of The Simpsons has a literal God, and the implications of that theological fact have been explored with enough seriousness to generate genuine insight. The most important thing about God in The Simpsons is the company he keeps. God talks to Homer. This is canonical and has been established across multiple main series episodes. Homer is apparently the kind of person God engages with directly. Homer is lazy, selfish, not particularly devout in any meaningful sense, prone to forgetting his responsibilities and then being surprised by their consequences. He is not, by any conventional religious standard, the kind of person who merits divine attention. Ned Flanders is the most devout person in Springfield. His faith is genuine and consistent and costly, a real organizing principle of his life rather than a habit or a performance. His prayers go into silence. God does not talk to Ned. This asymmetry is not incidental. It is a statement about the relationship between institutional religious practice and genuine divine attention. And the statement is specific. The God of The Simpsons does not respond to the most rigorous maintenance of religious form. The criteria for divine engagement, whatever they are not the criteria that conventional religious practice defines. The show does not name what the criteria are, but the candidate that the show's broader characterization suggests is a quality of unself-conscious authenticity, of being exactly who you are, without the self-monitoring and self-performance that religious discipline requires. Homer achieves this effortlessly because he lacks the self-awareness that would allow him to be otherwise. Ned achieves the opposite, a sustained conscious performance of goodness, and the consciousness of the performance seems to create a kind of distance that the genuine but unmonitored Homer does not have. This reading does not make Homer better than Ned. Homer's authentic self is not admirable by any conventional moral standard. The show is not saying that goodness is less valued than authenticity. It is saying something stranger and more interesting, that the divine attention in its universe is drawn to authenticity regardless of its moral quality, which is itself a theological position that has a long and serious history in mystical traditions across multiple religious cultures. The fool, the simpleton, the person too unself-conscious to perform virtue, has been understood in various religious traditions as occupying a specific and valued spiritual position precisely because their lack of self-monitoring produces a directness of relationship to the divine that is unavailable to people who are trying very hard to have it. Homer is the holy fool of Springfield. He does not know this. The show does not say this. But it has been depicting it consistently for 36 seasons, in every episode where God talks to Homer and is silent for Ned. Reverend Lovejoy is the show's most complete portrait of institutional religious failure that is sympathetic rather than satirical. He is not a hypocrite. He is not using his position for personal advantage in any obvious way. He is a man who genuinely held something and then, through the specific erosions of a long professional life, gradually lost the thing he held without any dramatic moment of betrayal or decision. The faith did not depart in a crisis. It evaporated through the steady application of pastoral demands that exceeded what his spiritual resources could sustain. The show gives his spiritual deterioration a specific and comic cause, his relationship with Ned Flanders as a pastoral client. Ned's relentless small questions, his constant demand for guidance on matters that do not require guidance, his occupation of pastoral bandwidth with requests that are not pastoral needs, accumulated over years into a deficit that left Lovejoy without reserves when genuine pastoral need arrived. The big things, the actual crises of faith and loss and suffering that are the real work of ministry, found him depleted. This is a portrait of a real occupational hazard in helping professions. The people who burn out in helping professions are not always the ones overwhelmed by genuine suffering. Sometimes they are the ones whose care was consumed by volume, by the accumulation of small demands that were individually manageable and collectively exhausting. Lovejoy's spiritual exhaustion is not the product of too much real ministry. It is the product of too many small claims on ministerial attention that, together, consumed what the real ministry would have needed to nourish him. The model trains he retreats into are what model trains always are as a serious hobby, a domain of complete control, where the world is small enough, and the rules are clear enough, and the outcomes are predictable enough to provide the experience of competence and completion that the actual vocation no longer reliably provides. He has found in the miniature railroad what his work used to give him. This is both funny and genuinely sad. The philosophical thread that runs most consistently through the show's entire run is the examination of individual choice within structural constraint, and it is the thread that connects every other major theme in the show's universe. Homer makes choices. The show is explicit about this. He chose to return the crayon to his brain when intelligence made his life unbearable. He chose to stay in his job. He chose his family over and over, across circumstances that would have justified different choices. These are choices, but they are choices made within structural constraints that are not of his making. He works for the man who destroyed his family. He lives in a town that poisoned his brain. He was born into circumstances that shaped the chooser before any choices were possible. The show maintains both of these simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. Homer is responsible for his choices. The conditions that shaped the chooser were not his responsibility. This is the correct moral position, which is harder to maintain than either pure determinism or pure individual responsibility, because it requires holding two things at once that feel like they should cancel each other out. Springfield is the laboratory for this examination. The structural constraints in Springfield are extreme enough to be visible as constraints rather than as background. The radiation, the economic capture, the institutional corruption, the collective denial that makes addressing any of it collectively difficult, these are not features of the natural landscape. They were built by specific choices made by specific people with specific interests. The residents are making choices within these constraints and are responsible for their choices, even though the constraints themselves were not their creation. This is the show's philosophical core, and it has been the subject of every season across 36 years without ever being named directly. What it means to be a choosing agent in a world that constrains agency. What responsibility looks like when the conditions for free choice are not fully present. How communities navigate the gap between the choices they could theoretically make and the choices the actual conditions of their lives make available. The show's engagement with mortality as a philosophical question, distinct from its treatment of specific deaths as emotional events, is sustained and interesting in ways that the comedy frame usually prevents from becoming too explicit. The characters of The Simpsons do not age. We have discussed this. But the show is aware of its own temporal situation in ways that surface in specific episodes that step outside the floating timeline long enough to acknowledge what the floating timeline costs. The flash-forward episodes, the episodes that imagine the characters in futures the format prevents, are the moments where the show most directly confronts the philosophical weight of keeping its characters permanently in place. In the most carefully made of these flash-forward episodes, what the future contains is not primarily different technology or different cultural circumstances. It is the completion of relationships and trajectories that the regular format keeps perpetually incomplete. Lisa in the future is a Lisa who has finished becoming herself, which is the thing the regular format prevents. Bart in the future is a Bart who has had to reckon with whether the direction his life took in the perpetual present of Springfield was the direction he would have chosen with fuller information. Marge and Homer in the future are a Marge and Homer whose long life together has a shape that the floating timeline makes invisible, because a shape requires a beginning and a middle and an end, and the floating timeline only provides the middle. The flash-forward episodes are the show mourning the life its format prevents its characters from living. They are the expression of what the show knows its structural choices have cost. The characters cannot age, the show cannot allow them to age, the format requires the permanent present, and the flash-forward episodes are the show's way of acknowledging that the permanent present is a kind of violence against the natural arc of human life, a violence that the show commits every week, and that is necessary, and that is also a real cost. This acknowledgement, visible in the best flash-forward episodes, is the show at its most philosophically honest. It knows what it is doing to its characters. It knows the floating timeline is a cage as well as a gift. It knows that the version of the Simpson family that never ages is also a version that never completes, never resolves, never becomes what it would have become if time had been allowed to do what time does. And it has chosen to maintain the cage because the alternative is ending the show. And ending the show means releasing the characters into a future that nobody controls, that the audience does not get to see, that the production cannot shape. The permanent present of Springfield is a choice about narrative control. The show keeps its characters in the floating timeline, because the floating timeline is where they are available to the audience, where their lives can be continued, where the story is not yet over. Allowing them to age would be allowing them to escape from the story, and stories do not easily allow their characters to escape. Characters belong to their stories in a way that people do not belong to their lives, and the floating timeline is the mechanism by which the show asserts this ownership. The philosophical implication is uncomfortable. The show that is, in many ways, about the value of ordinary human life, about the importance of the domestic and the familiar and the everyday, is also a show that keeps its characters from having the most important feature of ordinary human life, which is the experience of time passing and things changing, and people becoming and ceasing to be and being replaced by new people who are also temporary. The Simpsons loves its characters too much to let them grow up, which is another way of saying it loves its characters too much to let them live. And this is where every theory, every mystery, every question we have spent this time with arrives at the same destination. Whether it is the radiation that keeps Springfield's residents frozen in biological stasis, or the coma that keeps Homer's family preserved in his unconscious mind, or the collective denial that keeps the town's reality permanently managed, or the institutional corruption that keeps every meaningful change from arriving, the mechanism does not finally matter. What matters is the destination all those different mechanisms produce. Nothing changes. Nobody leaves. The story does not end. The family is always on the couch when you need them. Springfield is always there when you come back to it. The beer is always cold. The couch is always available. The children are always young. And whatever happened last week has been absorbed without trace into the permanent, comfortable present of a town that has learned, through whatever means necessary, to refuse the passage of time. This is what we built. This is what we maintain. This is why we come back. Not to solve the mysteries, though the mysteries are real, and the solving is satisfying. Not to trace the theories, though the theories illuminate things that the show's surface obscures. We come back because Springfield is the place where the things we love most about home, the specific texture of a familiar environment, the comfort of known faces and known configurations, the sense that some things will not change regardless of what changes outside, are maintained with an intensity that real places cannot sustain. Real places change. Real people age. Real families disperse and reconfigure and lose people and gain people and become different things than they were. The couch in the real childhood home is in a landfill or in someone else's living room. The family that watched television together on that couch has scattered into the different lives that time produces. Springfield does not scatter. The couch is always there. Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Bart is always 10. Lisa is always 8. Marge is always waiting, patient and blue-haired and slightly worried. And Homer always comes through the door at the end of a day that was harder than it needed to be and collapses into the life that is, despite everything, his. This is why we are here. Not in Springfield specifically. Here, in this format, in the quiet hours, with this show in the background of a mind that is winding down. Because some part of us needs what Springfield provides, which is the assurance that the thing we are afraid of losing is not yet lost, that the version of home that lives in memory is somewhere still intact, that the family we miss is somewhere still together on the couch in the yellow light of the television set. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years. It will probably keep running. The characters will stay the ages they are. Springfield will stay the impossible geography it is. Burns will stay alive through his weekly treatments. Ned will keep praying into the silence that God reserves for him. And Homer will keep surviving the unsurvivable because Homer's brain needs him to survive, or because the radiation has made him indestructible, or because the story will not allow him to end, or because we will not allow it. The reason does not finally matter. What matters is that the window on Evergreen Terrace is lit. Homer is watching television. Marge is beside him. The children are asleep in rooms that have held them for 36 years. Springfield is still there. It will be there when you wake up. It always is. There is a moment in many seasons of The Simpsons, usually arriving without announcement somewhere in the middle of a scene that is ostensibly about something else, where the camera lingers on a corner of Springfield that the plot does not require it to linger on. The scene is about whatever the scene is about. Homer's most recent disaster, or Bart's most recent scheme, or Lisa's most recent attempt to improve a situation that does not want to be improved, and the camera catches, in the background or in a cutaway that lasts a second or two longer than the joke requires, a piece of Springfield that exists for no narrative reason whatsoever. A side street, a building the characters are not entering, a storefront whose name you can almost read, a piece of the town that is simply there, detailed and specific, without the story requiring it to be there. These moments are the most direct evidence of what the Simpsons production team was actually doing with the world they built, and they are worth sitting with for a while. The city of Springfield, as a visual construction, was built in pieces across many years by many people, and the pieces were built to a standard that exceeded what any single episode required. The animators who worked on the backgrounds of The Simpsons during its most carefully produced seasons were working in a tradition of background art that valued completeness over economy, that understood the background as an environment for the characters to inhabit rather than merely a surface for the characters to be placed against. The difference between those two understandings of what a background is produces very different results, and the best backgrounds in the early and middle seasons of The Simpsons produce results that reward the kind of attention that background art almost never receives. Consider the layout of Springfield's downtown, as it can be reconstructed from multiple episodes across multiple seasons. There is a civic center area with a courthouse and a city hall that face each other across a square or plaza of some kind, the specific geometry of which varies somewhat depending on the episode, but which maintains enough consistency that the general layout is recoverable. There is a commercial district with a mix of retail and service businesses that gives the downtown a texture appropriate to a mid-size American city that has been there for a while, that has accumulated layers of economic activity without any single phase of development having completely displaced the previous ones. There are industrial buildings at the edge of the downtown area, the kind of low buildings with loading docks and minimal ornamentation that appeared in American cities wherever manufacturing or warehousing operated in proximity to downtown commercial life. There are residential streets that transition from the more urban density of the downtown edges into the suburban street grid where the Simpson house sits. All of this exists in the backgrounds of many episodes without being foregrounded, without being commented on, without serving any narrative purpose other than the purpose that all environments serve, which is to make the space the characters inhabit feel like a real space rather than a painted surface. The Springfield Elementary School building is one of the most frequently depicted structures in the show's history, and its visual design is specific enough to reward detailed examination. The building has a mid-century institutional quality that places its construction within the show's universe, somewhere in the post-war period when American municipalities were investing heavily in public education infrastructure. This is appropriate. A school built for Springfield's demographic in the post-war period would look exactly like this, would have exactly this combination of utilitarian construction standards and modest civic ambition that characterizes educational architecture from that era. The specific state of the building is also accurate in a way that goes beyond casual background detail. The building is in poor repair, not in the cartoonishly deteriorated way that communicates absolute institutional failure, but in the specific way that public buildings in under-resourced municipalities get when maintenance budgets have been consistently inadequate for long enough that deferred maintenance has accumulated into a visible state of managed decline. The paint is the wrong color because it was repainted with whatever was cheapest when it needed repainting. The fixtures are not quite right because they were replaced with whatever was available rather than whatever matched. The landscaping is minimal because minimal is what the ground's maintenance budget supports. This is the specific aesthetic of the public institution that has been asked to do more than its resources, support for long enough that the gap between mission and capacity has become physically visible. Springfield Elementary looks like Springfield Elementary because the people building the backgrounds understood what a school with that budget in that context would actually look like, and they built it to look like that rather than to look like a generic TV school. The power plant is the most symbolically loaded structure in Springfield's visual landscape, and its design encodes the show's attitude toward its subject in ways that are accessible without being obvious. The plant's cooling towers are the show's most recognizable silhouette. the shape that signals Springfield from any distance, the way that distinctive skyline features signal real cities. The designers chose to make the plant's most visible features its cooling towers rather than, say, its administrative buildings or its security perimeter. And this choice is significant. Cooling towers are industrial infrastructure that produces nothing. They manage waste heat. They are the visible evidence that a process of enormous energy is occurring somewhere below them, a process whose productive output is invisible, but whose waste is perpetually visible on the horizon. Making the cooling towers the plant's visual signature is making the waste the plant's signature, which is the show's most quietly accurate statement about what the plant represents in Springfield's life. The plant also sits in a specific relationship to the rest of Springfield that rewards attention. It is visible from many parts of town, particularly from areas that suggest lower income and less political power. The Simpsons neighborhood, the school, the areas where the workers who service the town's basic needs would live. It is not visible from, or at least is not consistently depicted in proximity to, the areas where wealth concentrates in Springfield. Burns lives somewhere that does not appear to have cooling towers on the horizon. The plant is visible to the people it employs and contaminates, and not visible to the person who owns it. This is not incidental. It is the show's accurate depiction of how industrial facilities are sited relative to different populations in real American communities. The Springfield Gorge deserves more attention than it usually receives, because the gorge is Springfield's most interesting piece of geography and its most revealing one. The gorge is a feature of the landscape that has no practical function in the life of Springfield. It does not provide water, it does not provide transportation, it does not represent a natural resource of any kind. It is simply there, enormous and permanent, a gap in the earth too large to bridge casually and too significant to ignore. Springfield was built around it rather than across it, which means the gorge is older than the town, and the town arranged itself in relation to the gorge rather than the gorge being a consequence of the town's activities. In real American landscape history, features like the gorge, dramatic natural interruptions of the terrain that predate settlement, and around which settlement organized itself, often carry significant geological and sometimes cultural history. The land remembers its own dramatic events in ways that human settlements inherit whether or not they know the history. The gorge in Springfield is a reminder that the landscape has a history that predates The Simpsons, predates Burns, predates the power plant and the Quickie Mart and the elementary school, and every other feature of the town that the show depicts. The land was doing something before Springfield was there, and the gorge is the most visible evidence of what it was doing. The show uses the gorge primarily as a site for danger and physical comedy, which is the obvious use for an enormous drop in terrain. But the gorge appears in non-comedic contexts, often enough to suggest that the production understood it as more than a joke location. In quieter episodes where a character needs to be alone or to think, the gorge appears as the place they go. Its scale makes individual human concerns feel appropriately small, without making them feel meaningless. It is the Springfield landscape's one genuinely sublime feature, the one place in town that does what sublime landscapes do, which is to produce in the observer a sense of their own smallness that is, paradoxically, a source of comfort rather than distress. When the show needs Springfield to feel genuinely consequential rather than merely cartoonishly large, the gorge is often in frame. Its presence in a scene is one of the show's quiet signals that the emotional register is shifting, that what follows will carry weight that the comedy usually insulates against. The Simpsons house itself is the most studied structure in the show's visual history, and it rewards a kind of sustained architectural attention that most fictional homes never receive, because most fictional homes are not visited weekly for 36 years. The house is presented as a 3-bedroom single-family home in a subdivision that was developed at some point in the post-war period, probably the late 1950s or the 1960s, when American suburbs were expanding rapidly and the specific architectural template of the small to mid-size single-family home with attached garage and modest yard was being reproduced at scale across the country. The house is of a type. It is not distinctive. This is the point. The interior of the house has a spatial logic that is maintained with surprising consistency across many seasons, and the consistency is worth noting because maintaining interior spatial logic across many seasons of an animated show requires sustained attention to a kind of detail that is easy to neglect when any given episode is not specifically about the house's interior. The kitchen is where Marge most often appears, which is both a statement about Marge's domestic role, a statement the show is sometimes critical of and sometimes simply depicts, and a statement about the kitchen as the functional center of the house's daily life. The kitchen in The Simpsons is not a decorative space. It is a working room that looks like a working room, with the specific clutter and wear that a kitchen used by a family of 5 in their actual daily lives would accumulate. The living room, with the couch and the television, is the show's most iconic interior space, the one that the opening credits return to every episode, and that functions as the gravitational center of the family's shared life. The couch gag, which has been running as long as the show has been running, uses this space as a canvas for variations that range from simple physical comedy to elaborate visual set pieces, to moments of genuine surrealism that step outside the show's universe entirely. The couch gag works because the living room is so established as the gravitational center that anything that happens there, any disruption of the expected scene of the family arriving and sitting, carries automatic significance. The space has accumulated meaning across 36 seasons of the same arrival and the same sitting, and the gag draws on that accumulated meaning by disrupting it. The basement and the garage, in the few episodes that depict them in any detail, contain the material residue of Homer's many projects and phases, the detritus of abandoned enterprises, of attempts at self-improvement or income supplementation or creative expression that were pursued with characteristic enthusiasm and abandoned with characteristic lack of follow-through, accumulates in these spaces the way unused material accumulates in the functional dead zones of real houses. The basement and the garage are where the episodes end up, not the bad episodes, but the projects. The home brewing equipment, the various items from Homer's many temporary jobs, the evidence of the person Homer was trying to be during a period when he was trying to be something different, stored in the places where things go when they are no longer being tried. This is accurate. Real houses accumulate their inhabitants' histories in exactly this way. The Simpson house feels real in a way that many fictional homes do not, because it shows evidence of the specific people who live in it, not just the general type of family that houses like this are supposed to contain. The Simpsons created a vocabulary, not just the catchphrases, though the catchphrases are real and their penetration into the American lexicon is genuine and sometimes surprising even to people who have not watched the show in decades. The show created a way of talking about American life, a register of comic observation that has influenced how a generation of writers and critics and ordinary people in conversation describe the world around them. This is a consequence of what happens when a piece of media is sufficiently excellent and sufficiently widespread and sufficiently long-running. It stops being a show that people watch and becomes part of the water that the culture swims in. The references stop being references and become vocabulary. The phrases stop being quotes and become ways of speaking that no longer require attribution. The specific contribution of The Simpsons to the language of American cultural observation is the observation delivered in a register that is simultaneously funny and genuinely incisive, that does not require you to choose between laughing at something and understanding it. The joke and the insight are the same thing. You laugh because the insight is correct and correctly expressed, not because the insight has been set aside in favor of the joke. This is a specific and difficult thing to do consistently over a long period, and The Simpsons did it at a level that has not been matched by any subsequent American comedy. It is the thing that the show's imitators most consistently failed to replicate. The register they were imitating is identifiable. The specific combination of wit and truth that makes the register work, the precise calibration that allows the joke and the insight to be the same movement rather than two separate movements in sequence, is harder to produce than it looks when it is working. The catchphrases themselves are worth examining as a category because they are more interesting than catchphrases usually are. Homer's frustrated exclamation, his specific sound when something has gone wrong, is the most famous piece of vocalization the show produced, and its cultural penetration is remarkable enough that it has appeared in contexts that have no connection to the show at all, produced by people who may not know where it originated. It entered the culture as a sound that means something specific, that communicates a specific kind of comic frustration, and it retained that meaning independent of its origins. This is what happens to cultural production when it is successful enough and specific enough. The specific becomes generic. The origin becomes irrelevant. The sound or the phrase or the gesture exists on its own as a cultural unit with a fixed meaning that requires no attribution. This is a form of success that is rare and that carries a specific quality of loss alongside it. When something becomes this embedded in the culture, it becomes harder to see where it came from. The show that produced it becomes invisible behind the cultural artifact it produced. The Simpsons generated enough of these artifacts that the show is, for many people who have a relationship with the phrases and the sounds and the visual vocabulary, something they know without knowing they know it. They carry the show's vocabulary without necessarily being able to identify the show that produced it. Bart's catchphrases have a quality that is easy to miss if you are focused on their content rather than their form. The phrases are not jokes in the traditional sense. They are not setups and punchlines or reversals of expectation. They are performances of an attitude, expressions of a specific kind of cool that was genuinely influential in the early 1990s and that the show was both observing and contributing to simultaneously. The phrases captured something that was already in the cultural air and gave it a specific verbal form that made it available to more people and in more contexts than it had been before. This is what good catchphrases do. They do not invent attitudes. They crystallize attitudes that already exist in the culture, give them a form precise enough to be portable, and in becoming portable, help to spread the attitude they captured. The show's relationship to its own catchphrases evolved in interesting ways across its run. In the early seasons, the phrases emerged organically from character and situation. They were not designed to be catchphrases. They became catchphrases because they were accurate expressions of character that turned out to resonate beyond the specific episode that generated them. The later seasons developed a different relationship to catchphrases, one where the awareness that the show produced catchphrases was present in the writing in ways it was not in the early seasons. The self-consciousness about the catchphrase as a category changed the quality of what was produced, producing phrases that were designed to function as catchphrases rather than phrases that became catchphrases by being right. The difference is audible if you listen for it. The early catchphrases sound like things a character would say. The later ones sometimes sound like things a character is saying because a character who says catchphrases would say something like this. Springfield's naming conventions are the show's most consistent running comedy, and they have a specific quality that distinguishes them from the broad parody naming that less careful shows use. The businesses and institutions of Springfield have names that work on 2 or 3 levels simultaneously. The surface level is the obvious joke, the one available to anyone who reads the name without thinking about it further. But the names that last, the ones that appear repeatedly and that fans remember with genuine affection, have a secondary level that rewards the extra moment of attention, a darker or more specific joke underneath the surface, one that changes the meaning when you reach it. The funeral homes are the clearest example. Springfield's funeral industry is depicted with a regularity that reflects the show's willingness to treat death as a normal feature of town life rather than a special occasion, and the funeral homes have names that carry the show's specific register of dark comedy about the relationship between the commerce of death and the experience of it. The names acknowledge that this commerce exists, that the experience of death passes through institutional hands that have financial interests in it, and that this fact is both completely normal and somewhat disturbing if you think about it for an extra moment. The schools and churches have names that work differently, with more affection and less darkness, but with the same quality of having been thought about specifically rather than generated by formula. The names feel like they were chosen by someone who understood what kind of institution they were naming, and what the name could communicate about that institution if chosen right. Krusty's show title, the naming conventions for Springfield's media institutions generally, the names of the various political and civic bodies that appear across the show's run, all of them have this quality. They were chosen with care. They were chosen by people who understood that the background is part of the world, that what the background says contributes to what the world means, and that the contribution is worth making well, even when nobody is required to notice it. The show's title cards deserve attention that they almost never receive, because the title cards for individual episodes are where some of the show's best pure writing occurs. An episode title is a small piece of writing. It has one job, which is to name what follows, and the constraints are severe. It must be short enough to fit a title card, specific enough to identify the episode, and ideally clever enough to add something to the episode without giving too much away. The Simpsons, particularly in its peak seasons, elevated the episode title from a production necessity to a small art form. The best episode titles are jokes that only fully land after the episode is over. puns or references that become retroactively more meaningful in light of what the episode contained. They reward returning attention, the same way that a good song lyric rewards multiple listenings, because different levels of the lyric become available at different moments of engagement. The episode title that seems merely descriptive on first reading becomes, after the episode, a precise and clever summary of what the episode was actually about beneath its surface plot. This is a very small thing. Episode titles are among the most overlooked pieces of writing in television production, and the investment of genuine creative effort in them is largely invisible to any audience that is not specifically looking for it. The Simpsons made that investment consistently across many seasons because the standard of the room held that everything in the show, including the things that would be seen for half a second before the story began, should be as good as the available creativity could make it. 36 years is a long time for anything to persist, and it is an almost inconceivably long time for a piece of narrative entertainment to maintain its central characters in an essentially unchanged state. The floating timeline, the mechanism by which The Simpsons avoids aging its characters while updating its contemporary references to remain current, is well understood as a narrative device. What is less often examined is what 36 years of sustained production does to a story at the level of meaning rather than at the level of mechanics. Stories that run for a very long time undergo a specific kind of transformation that shorter stories do not experience. They accumulate, not just plot accumulation, the addition of more events to the characters' histories, but meaning accumulation, the gradual transformation of what the characters and situations signify through the weight of sustained attention that the audience has brought to them over a very long time. Homer Simpson in the first season is a specific character in a specific situation. Homer Simpson, after 36 seasons, is still that specific character in that specific situation, but he is also everything the audience has made of him across 36 seasons, of watching, of thinking, of quoting, of identifying with, of discussing, of remembering. He carries the accumulated weight of decades of cultural engagement, and that weight changes what he is in ways that are real even though they are not produced by anything that happens within the story. This is the situation of any sufficiently long-running character in any sufficiently pervasive piece of media. The character exists as a cultural object in addition to existing as a fictional person, and the cultural object is shaped by forces that the fictional person has no access to. Homer has been used as a rhetorical device in political arguments, as a cultural touchstone in academic papers, as a reference point in conversations about intelligence and labor and family and American decline. All of this is attached to him now. He carries it whether the show acknowledges it or not. What this means for the experience of watching the show across its full run is that the show becomes more resonant, not necessarily better in any conventional sense, but more resonant as it continues. The accumulation of cultural meaning gives even unremarkable episodes a weight they would not have had in isolation, because even an unremarkable episode of The Simpsons is an episode of The Simpsons, which is to say, it is a document of the thing that the show has become through 36 years of sustained existence in the culture. The early seasons of the show exist in a different relationship to cultural time than the later seasons. The early seasons were being produced in real time, before the show had become what it would become, before its significance was established, before the accumulated cultural meaning that now surrounds it existed. They were episodes of a new show, made by people who did not know whether the show would last another season. They have been retroactively elevated by everything that came after them, by the cultural significance that accumulated around the show over time, and that elevation is real even though the episodes themselves are unchanged. The later seasons exist in a more complicated relationship to cultural time. They are made in the shadow of the accumulated significance, aware that they are episodes of The Simpsons in a way that the early episodes were not aware of being episodes of a cultural institution. This awareness changes what is possible. The early episodes could simply be what they were. The later episodes must be episodes of The Simpsons, which is a more complicated thing to be. The relationship between the show's present and its past is one of the stranger features of watching it across its full run. The floating timeline means that the characters' pasts are always available in flashback, but those pasts have been revised across the show's run in ways that reflect the temporal slide of the floating timeline. Homer's past is not fixed. It has been updated, revised, retold in versions that place his formative years in progressively more recent decades. This means that the Homer who exists in the show's present is a Homer whose past has been continuously rewritten to fit the present. a Homer whose origin story is perpetually in revision. This is a strange kind of existence. Most characters in most stories have fixed pasts. The events that form them are established and remain established, providing the stable foundation from which the character's present circumstances and future choices can be understood. Homer's past is not stable. It is a dynamic document revised to fit the temporal needs of the floating timeline, always contemporary enough to make the age mathematics work, never fully settled into a single canonical version. The philosophical weight of this, taken seriously rather than simply accepted as a production convention, is considerable. Homer is a person whose past continuously revises itself. The foundation of his identity, the events that formed him, is not stable. He is built on shifting ground. The coherence of his identity, the recognizable Homerness that persists across all the revisions of his past, is not produced by the stability of his history. It is produced by something else, by the consistency of his values, his loves, his characteristic responses to the world that persists through the changes in the biographical details that are supposed to anchor those values. Homer is recognizably Homer, regardless of whether his high school memories are set in 1974 or 1994. The biographical facts change. The person remains. This is either a demonstration that personal identity is not fundamentally grounded in biographical facts, that who you are is determined by something more fundamental than what has happened to you, or it is a demonstration that the show has found a way to maintain a recognizable character despite revising the foundational material, because the character was never really grounded in the biographical facts to begin with. Either reading is interesting, either reading is worth spending time with, and the show has, by running long enough to require the revision of its characters' pasts, created the conditions that make either reading available, which is the kind of thing that 36 years of sustained production can do to a story that a shorter story cannot do. The audience's relationship to the show's time is the final element of this that deserves attention, because the audience's relationship to the show's time is not the same as the show's relationship to its own time, and the gap between them is where some of the most interesting things about the long-running Simpsons reside. People who have watched The Simpsons across its full run have aged along with the show. They encountered it at specific ages and in specific life circumstances, and the show has accompanied them through the subsequent years and life changes in the way that very few pieces of media are able to accompany anyone through very much. The show they are watching in the current season is not the same show they were watching when they first encountered it. Not because the show has changed dramatically, though it has changed, but because the person watching it has changed dramatically. The accumulated years and experiences and changes in perspective that they brought to every subsequent watching have made every subsequent episode different from what it would have been. This is the experience of all durable media, but it is an experience that The Simpsons produces with particular intensity because the show has been so consistently present across so much of so many people's lives. The relationship is personal in a way that is rare for a piece of mass entertainment. People do not just watch The Simpsons. They have a history with it, a relationship that extends across decades of their own history and that carries meaning specific to the particular circumstances in which they encountered it at particular moments of their lives. The show is, for many people, a kind of autobiography, not because they share Homer's experiences or Lisa's struggles or Bart's particular form of defiance, but because the show has been the backdrop against which their own experiences occurred, and the experiences and the show have become intertwined in memory, in the way that the things that share time and memory tend to become intertwined. You remember the episode and you remember what you were doing when you watched it, and the two memories carry each other, and the show becomes a map of your own life's timeline, as well as a map of Springfield's impossible geography. This is what 36 years of sustained production does to a story. It makes the story inseparable from the audience's own stories. It makes the fictional town a real place in the emotional geography of the people who have spent enough time there. It makes the fictional family a real family in the sense that matters, which is the sense of being people whose continued existence you care about and whose absence would leave a specific gap in your life that something else would have to fill. Springfield fills a specific gap. When it eventually stops, something will have to fill it. Nothing will fill it quite right. Because nothing will have been there for 36 years, will have accumulated that specific weight of sustained presence, will have become that specific part of the landscape of that many people's lives. The gap will be a Springfield-shaped gap, and it will persist. the way all gaps left by genuinely significant presences persist in the specific space that was theirs. The Simpsons works as a show, has continued to work across 36 seasons with a consistency that defies the entropy that normally governs long-form entertainment because its 5 central characters are more specifically and more accurately conceived than the comedy format usually requires and than most audiences initially recognize. Each member of the Simpson family carries something real. Not a type, not a comedy function, but a real psychological orientation toward the world. A real set of needs and fears and coping strategies and ways of being in relationships that the show has maintained with surprising fidelity across decades of episodes written by many different people. Homer's psychological reality is the one that takes the most work to see clearly, because it is most thoroughly obscured by the comedy that surrounds it. Homer is not stupid in the straightforward sense. He is cognitively limited in ways that are specific and have specific causes, but within the domains where his cognition is functional, he is not without intelligence. His social intelligence is real. He reads people well enough to navigate complex social situations that his limited abstract reasoning would not prepare him for. His emotional intelligence, in specific contexts, is considerably higher than his general intelligence would suggest. He loves his family with a clarity and a completeness that is not diminished by his inability to articulate it or to act on it consistently. He knows what matters. He just cannot always reliably do the things that what matters requires. The specific combination of genuine limitation and genuine love is what makes Homer work as a character across so many different kinds of stories. He can be the comedic center of an episode about his incompetence and the emotional center of an episode about his love for his family. And the character is coherent across both because the incompetence and the love are both real and both products of the same psychological formation. He is not 2 characters. He is one character with a wide emotional range who happens to be also cognitively limited, and the limitation and the love coexist in the same person rather than canceling each other out. Homer's need for acceptance is the feature of his psychology that explains most of his behavior in contexts where the behavior would otherwise seem inexplicable. He wants to be liked. He wants to matter. He wants the people whose opinion matters to him to think well of him. These are universal human desires. In Homer, they are particularly acute because his history, the absent mother and the cold, distant father, and the decades of being underestimated by the educational and professional systems he moved through, gave him very little of the basic validation that makes these desires manageable rather than urgent. He needs it, specifically, because he did not get enough of it early enough to build the internal resource of self-worth that makes external validation less necessary. This is the engine behind most of Homer's worst decisions. The decisions that look stupidest, the ones where you cannot believe he would make the choice he makes, are usually decisions driven by the desire for acceptance from some specific source. He accepts humiliation from people he wants to be accepted by. He abandons things that matter to him for the approval of people who do not matter to him. He makes himself smaller or larger or stupider or louder in the specific shapes that the people around him seem to want, trying to find the configuration that makes them accept him. The tragedy of Homer's acceptance-seeking is that the people who actually accept him unreservedly, his family, are the people he is least able to receive acceptance from. Not because he does not value it, but because its consistency makes it feel less informative. If Marge always accepts him, then her acceptance does not resolve the question of whether he is acceptable. The question can only be resolved in the emotional logic of someone with Homer's psychology by acceptance from someone who might not accept him. The unconditional love he has at home is the thing he should need least more of, and it is what he is least able to metabolize as evidence that he is acceptable. Marge's psychological reality requires more care to discuss accurately than most analyses of the character provide, because the most visible aspects of her characterization are the ones that are most likely to be read as either idealization of domesticity or critique of it, and the show is doing something more complicated than either. Marge is not primarily a domestic figure in the sense of someone whose identity is constituted by domestic roles. She is a person who has chosen to invest her considerable competence in domestic roles, for reasons that are specific to her situation and her psychology, and the choice is real, even though the circumstances that produced it are constraining in ways that sometimes make the choice feel less free than it is. Her competence is genuine and considerable. The household she manages is genuinely complex, given the specific people in it and the specific challenges they generate, and she manages it at a high level with resources that are not always adequate to the demands. Her project management ability, her ability to hold multiple priorities in mind simultaneously and to allocate limited resources across competing needs, her capacity for sustained effort without recognition, all of these are genuine skills being genuinely exercised. The fact that they are being exercised in a domestic context rather than a professional one does not diminish them. What Marge carries that makes her more than a capable domestic manager is the specific form of loneliness that comes from investing deeply in people who are not capable of fully returning the investment. She loves Homer with full knowledge of what Homer is. She loves Bart despite consistent evidence that loving Bart produces roughly equal amounts of joy and exhaustion. She loves Lisa with a particular intensity that sometimes struggles against the fact that Lisa has grown into a person who is significantly more capable than the environment Marge can provide for her. These loves are real and they are chosen, continuously, in the full knowledge of their costs. Marge is not a martyr. She is not staying in the life she has because she has no alternative and no self. She is staying in the life she has because she has chosen it, and the choice is renewed regularly and is made by a person who is capable of different choices. The specific evidence for this is in the episodes that place Marge in contexts where she demonstrates clearly that she is capable of excellence in domains beyond her domestic role. She is a gifted painter. She is a capable police officer. She has, in various episodes across the show's run, demonstrated competence in professional contexts that her domestic circumstances do not call for. The competence is there. The domestic choice is a choice made in the presence of alternatives, not in their absence. What this means for the character is that Marge's situation is not a trap in the simple sense. It is a set of commitments freely made, maintained through ongoing choice, producing both genuine satisfactions and genuine costs. The genuine satisfactions are real. The genuine costs are real. The show has depicted both, across many seasons, without resolving them into a simple moral about domesticity or choice or the value of different kinds of life. Lisa is the show's most intellectually honest depiction of what it costs to be the kind of person she is, in the kind of environment she inhabits. And that honesty is what makes her the character that the show's most devoted viewers are most likely to find the most affecting. She is 8 years old, and she has already understood, through evidence rather than theory, that the world does not organize itself around what is true or what is good. She knows that the things she cares about most are not the things that the community around her values. She knows that her intelligence is not a reliable route to connection with the people in her life. She knows that the gap between what is and what should be is large and persistent and resistant to her individual efforts to close it. And she keeps trying anyway. This is Lisa's most defining characteristic. Not her intelligence, which is the feature most discussions of her lead with. The defining characteristic is the persistence of her effort in the face of consistent evidence that the effort does not produce the results. The effort is aimed at. She keeps playing the saxophone because the saxophone matters to her. She keeps caring about the environment and about animals and about justice because those things matter to her. She keeps trying to connect with Homer despite the evidence that Homer is not reliably capable of the kind of connection she needs, because the possibility of the connection matters to her more than the evidence of its rarity. This persistence is not naive. Lisa is not persisting because she has not understood the evidence against persisting. She is persisting because she has decided at some level that the show does not always make explicit that the alternative to persistence is a kind of surrender that she is not willing to make. The surrender would be easier. The surrender would produce less suffering in the short term. But the surrender would cost something that the suffering does not cost, and she has decided that the cost of surrender is higher than the cost of the suffering. This is a genuinely sophisticated ethical position for an 8-year-old to hold, and the show depicts it with enough consistency and enough specificity that you believe Lisa has arrived at it through actual experience rather than through precocious theorizing. She is not performing moral sophistication. She is doing the difficult thing because she has determined that the difficult thing is what she is called to do, and the call comes from inside her rather than from any external authority that validates it. Bart's position in the family and in the show is the position that is most often discussed in terms of his function as an audience surrogate, the mischievous child whose adventures drive plot, and that function is real. But the character beneath the function is also real, and it is worth examining separately from the function. Bart is angry. This is the foundational fact about him that the comedy format continually transforms into something more manageable but never fully dissolves. The anger is specific and has specific causes. He is in a situation that consistently undervalues what he actually is and consistently attempts to punish him for being it. He is asked to be something he is not, to organize his intelligence in ways it does not naturally organize, to value things he does not naturally value, to succeed at tasks that are not connected to any form of success he can actually imagine for himself. The response to this situation that Bart has developed is the defensive performance of not caring. If you perform not caring convincingly enough, the failure to succeed at the things you were not going to succeed at anyway becomes legible as a choice rather than a defeat. The performance of not caring is a way of retaining agency in a situation where the outcomes are not in your control. If I am failing because I chose not to try, I am not being failed by the system. I am failing on my own terms. This is a coping strategy that children in Bart's specific situation actually develop, and the show depicts it with an accuracy that suggests the writers understood from experience what the strategy does to a person. The strategy works, in the short term, at the specific thing it is designed to do, which is to protect the self-image from the damage that genuine effort and genuine failure would produce. It does not work at the things that the strategy prevents by making them seem not to matter. The development of the capacities that are genuinely there but undeveloped because the defensive performance of not caring extended its protective coverage to the capacities themselves. Maggie is the family member whose inner life the show has been most careful to keep available to interpretation rather than resolved into definition, and this carefulness is the most interesting creative choice the show makes in its depiction of the family. She watches. This is her characteristic action, the thing she consistently does across every context she appears in. She watches with an attention that is more complete and more sustained than anyone else's attention in the show, partly because she is not speaking and not acting and not doing anything else that would compete with the watching, but also because the watching has a quality of deliberateness, of purposefulness, that separates it from the passive visual reception that constitutes most characters' default relationship to their surroundings. What she is watching and what she makes of it and what she intends to do with it are the questions the show has consistently declined to fully answer, and the declination is its own kind of answer. The show does not know what Maggie is going to become any more than the characters do. She is the family member with the most uncertain future, because she is the youngest, and because infants have less committed futures than older people do, but also because she is in some sense the family's capacity for surprise, the member whose nature is least determined, and whose development is most genuinely open. Homer's trajectory was shaped by things that happened to him before the show began. Marge's trajectory was shaped by choices made before the show began. Bart and Lisa are both in the process of becoming shaped by what is happening to them in the show's present. Maggie is still in the show's present before the shaping has fully begun, which means she is the character who is most fully available to possibility. This is both the most beautiful and the most melancholy thing about her. She is the family's possibility, the member who could become any of several very different people depending on what happens next, and the floating timeline means that what happens next never fully arrives. She stays in the before. The shaping is always still ahead of her. The person she might become is always still becoming. A town is its institutions. The specific character of a community can be read through the institutions it has built and maintains and relies upon. And Springfield's institutions are a remarkably complete set of civic structures for a fictional town, complete enough that the picture they collectively paint of Springfield as a community is specific and interesting and darker in certain ways than the comedy format usually foregrounds. Springfield has a functioning municipal government. This is easy to take for granted because the government appears primarily in episodes where it fails in interesting ways, and the comedy of government failure has obscured the underlying fact that there is a government to fail. There is a mayor's office with a mayor who has been in that office for the majority of the show's run. There is a city council whose deliberations appear occasionally in episodes that require civic decision-making. There is a planning department, and a health department, and a police department, and the other functional arms of municipal government that a town of Springfield's size would require to operate. Mayor Quimby is the face of this government, And the face is worth examining because it has been the face of Springfield's government for a very long time in a way that real American municipal politics does not usually accommodate. Real American mayors face term limits in most jurisdictions, face electoral accountability from the voters they are supposed to serve, face scrutiny from a press corps whose job is to make their exercise of power visible. Quimby faces elections, in the sense that election episodes appear occasionally in the show's run, and Quimby is consistently the subject of them, but he wins these elections reliably and returns to office without the accountability dynamics that real elections are supposed to provide. The explanation for this that the show provides is the explanation that explains the same phenomenon in real American municipal politics. The incumbent, who has been in office long enough to have built a political machine that controls the mechanisms of accountability, has a structural advantage that makes electoral accountability significantly less than theory would suggest. Quimby controls the process well enough to be largely immune to its results, which is a depiction of how machine politics actually works that is more honest than most fictional depictions of local government. His personal corruption is specific and multidimensional. He is not simply a man who takes bribes, though he does. He is a man who has built a specific kind of relationship with specific kinds of power, a relationship in which the exchange of political favors for financial and social support is so naturalized, so thoroughly normalized into the everyday operation of his office, that it has ceased to register as corruption and become something closer to civic custom. Everyone knows how Quimby operates. Nobody is particularly surprised by any specific instance of how he operates. The corruption is not hidden. It is simply the way things work, and the way things work is what the political culture of Springfield has organized itself around. Springfield's court system appears frequently enough across the show's run to constitute a significant portrait of how justice functions in a small American community, and the portrait is specific and recognizable in ways that go beyond simple satire. Judge Snyder, who presides over most of Springfield's significant legal proceedings, is a judge who operates with discretion that is sometimes well applied and sometimes catastrophically misapplied. And the difference between the two is not always clearly related to the merits of the case before him. His legal reasoning is visible in his decisions, and the reasoning sometimes tracks the law, and sometimes tracks his personal views, and sometimes tracks the path of least institutional resistance. This is an accurate depiction of how judicial decision-making actually functions at the lower levels of the American court system, where the formal requirements of legal reasoning coexist with the informal pressures of community, relationships, precedent, and the particular personality of the person in the robe. The Springfield Bar, represented primarily through the figure of Lionel Hutz, is the show's most sustained comic portrait of legal practice, and Hutz is a character who rewards attention beyond his function as a joke about incompetent lawyers. Hutz is incompetent in specific ways. He does not know the law well enough to navigate its requirements reliably. He does not have the organizational capacity to maintain the practice management systems that a functional law office requires. He is sometimes unclear on the distinction between legal strategy and outright fraud, and on those occasions he errs toward fraud with a confidence that suggests he is not always aware that the distinction is being crossed. But Hutz is doing something real. He is providing legal representation to people who cannot afford better legal representation, at a price point that makes representation accessible to a population that the legal system otherwise does not serve. The representation he provides is of questionable quality and sometimes actively harmful, but its availability, its existence as an option for people who would otherwise have no legal advocacy at all, is real. Hutz is occupying a genuine gap in the legal services market, filling a need that the system creates by making adequate legal representation financially inaccessible to most of its population. This is a portrait of the access to justice crisis in American law that the show embeds in the character of a broadly comic, incompetent lawyer, and the portrait is accurate enough in its structural outline to be recognizable to anyone who has had to navigate the legal system without resources sufficient to afford the representation the system implicitly requires. Springfield's media institutions are the show's most sustained portrait of how information and public opinion operate in a small American community, and the portrait is more specific and more honest than the broad satirical comedy of Kent Brockman would suggest. Channel 6 News, where Brockman delivers Springfield's local television journalism, is a depiction of local television news that is recognizable to anyone who has actually watched local television news in an American market. The format, the presentation conventions, the specific rhythm of local news that alternates human interest stories with crime coverage, with weather forecasts, with sports updates, the aesthetic of the studio, the specific quality of the on-screen relationship between the anchors. All of this is accurate in the way that observation rather than research produces. What Channel 6 News depicts about how local journalism functions, specifically about how local journalism functions in communities where the power relationships are as unbalanced as they are in Springfield, is the most interesting part of its portrait. The news function in a community where a single large employer provides a significant portion of the economic base is not a fully independent function. The large employer's interests are woven into the community's interests in ways that make covering the large employer as an outside observer, as journalism ideally conceives of its relationship to power, difficult to accomplish without affecting the institutional relationships that the news organization depends on to operate. Brockman's relationship to Burns's power is never explicit in the way that a corrupt transaction would be explicit. It is a relationship of mutual accommodation, of understood limits, of the kind of awareness that develops when both parties understand the parameters within which coverage will occur. Burns is not depicted as controlling Channel 6 directly. He does not need to. The awareness of his power in Springfield's economy and political life is sufficient to shape what the news covers and how it covers it without requiring explicit instruction. This is an accurate depiction of how media capture actually works in smaller communities. It does not require the corrupt transaction that dramatic depictions of media capture usually feature. It requires only that the people producing the news understand the environment in which they operate and make the accommodations that operating in that environment requires. The accommodations accumulate. The coverage that results reflects the accumulated accommodations without any individual decision having been overtly corrupted. The Springfield school system is the institution that most directly affects the show's central characters and that the show depicts with the most sustained attention across its run. The school faces the specific combination of challenges that public schools in under-resourced American communities face: inadequate funding, a student population with needs that exceed the available resources for addressing them, administrative and teaching staff who are managing these inadequacies with varying degrees of skill and commitment, and a community that simultaneously expects the school to produce excellent outcomes and refuses to provide the resources that excellent outcomes would require. Principal Skinner, for all the complications of his actual identity, represents the administrator in this situation with uncomfortable accuracy. He is a person who cares about the institution he runs, who has specific values about what education should accomplish and specific views about what his students need, and who is trapped between those values and the resource realities that prevent him from acting on them. His authoritarian streak is not the expression of a person who likes authority for its own sake. It is the adaptation of a person who has discovered that maintaining control over a chaotic environment with inadequate resources requires more control than would be necessary in a better resourced environment. The teachers of Springfield Elementary, particularly Mrs. Krabappel, carry their own specific portrait of the teaching profession in under-resourced settings. The exhaustion is real. The cynicism is a consequence of sustained exposure to conditions that make idealism expensive. The specific way that Krabappel relates to Bart, with a mixture of genuine care for his potential and genuine frustration with his resistance, is the relationship of a teacher who has enough remaining investment in her students to find Bart's situation genuinely frustrating, rather than simply categorizing him as an inconvenient case to be managed toward the end of the fodder year. Her relationship with Skinner, the sustained and complicated quasi-romantic dynamic that the show has maintained across many seasons, is one of the more realistic depictions of how institutional proximity and shared professional culture create specific kinds of intimate relationships, not always fully acknowledged or fully acted upon, between people who would not otherwise be in each other's lives. They are thrown together by the institution. The institution shapes their relationship. The relationship has qualities that are specific to the institutional context rather than to the people as individuals, and it would not exist in the same form outside the Springfield Elementary building that contains them both. The Simpsons is more musical than most discussions of it acknowledge, and the musical dimensions of the show are more interesting and more integral to what the show is doing than a simple acknowledgement of the score's quality would capture. The show's composer, Alf Clausen, produced a body of work for the series that spans hundreds of episodes and encompasses an enormous range of musical styles, references, and original compositions. And the work is interesting not just as incidental television scoring, but as a specific musical commentary on the material it accompanies. Clausen understood that The Simpsons was a show where the gap between the comedy surface and the emotional or thematic content underneath it was the most important creative space. And he scored that gap, the space between what the image shows and what the scene is actually about, with a consistency and a subtlety that rewards careful listening. The Simpsons theme itself is a piece of music that accomplishes something that most television themes do not attempt, which is to capture the emotional register of the show it introduces in a form that is both immediately recognizable and surprisingly complex on repeated exposure. The theme is bright and brassy in a way that signals comedy and Saturday morning cartoon energy, which is partly a period choice that reflects the show's position in late 1980s American television. But it is also specifically constructed to contain something underneath the brightness, a slight quality of melancholy in the string arrangement that surfaces most clearly in the theme's quieter middle section, the section that plays over the commute shots and the school dismissal and the family's arrival home, the sequence of everyday life that the theme scores as something simultaneously ordinary and fleeting. The most significant musical contribution of the show's run is the sustained use of song as a mode of emotional expression that the regular dialogue cannot accommodate. The Simpsons integrates musical numbers into its episodes more frequently, and with more genuine investment than most American live-action or animated comedies, and the musical numbers carry a specific function that the spoken dialogue cannot serve. Music in The Simpsons episodes is consistently used to express things that the characters cannot directly express in spoken form, to give voice to emotional states that the characters' ordinary modes of expression cannot accommodate, to create the space for honesty that the comedy frame usually prevents. When Homer sings, in the specific episodes where Homer's song is the emotional center rather than the comic surface, the song is doing something that Homer cannot do in conversation. He cannot express directly what the song expresses. The formal and emotional conventions of the song form give him permission to say what the ordinary conversation does not permit. The show has been careful to use this only when the emotional content genuinely warrants it, which means that when it is used, it has not been diluted by overuse and it retains the specific power that comes from the form being deployed at full capacity. Lisa's relationship to music is the most deeply developed musical characterization in the show's history, and it is worth sitting with in some detail because it is doing something more specific than most discussions of it capture. Lisa plays saxophone. This is established firmly in the first season and maintained with complete consistency across 36 seasons and hundreds of episodes. The saxophone is her instrument, her chosen form of expression, the domain in which she is most fully herself in ways that the rest of her life does not always permit. The choice of saxophone specifically is not arbitrary. The saxophone is not a classical instrument in the way that the instruments that would be most consistent with Lisa's academic orientation, piano or violin or cello, are classical instruments. It is a jazz instrument, associated with improvisation and emotional directness, and a tradition of music as immediate personal expression rather than as the execution of a composed work. Lisa plays jazz on the saxophone in the background of her own life. She improvises. She expresses directly. The music she makes is hers in a way that the performances her school and her community would expect from an academically gifted child. The piano recital, the orchestral concert, the classical repertoire are not. The saxophone is where she goes when she needs to be herself, which is a specific characterological statement that the show has been making quietly for 36 years by maintaining the saxophone as her instrument. The most emotionally resonant saxophone moments in the show's history are the moments when Lisa plays alone, not for an audience, not in performance. In the moments when she is working something out, when she is in a state of feeling that she cannot address in any other way, the saxophone appears, and the music that comes from it is the music of someone using the form to process something real. These moments are brief, and they are not commented on within the episodes that contain them. They are the show's acknowledgement, without words, that Lisa is always carrying something that the rest of her life cannot quite hold. The musical episodes, the full-length episodes structured around extended musical sequences, are the show's most formally ambitious work. They operate in a different register than the regular episodic format and require a different kind of attention. They are the show at its most willing to be what it actually is underneath the comedy, to let the emotional content surface in a form that the comedy frame usually prevents. The best of these episodes are the ones where the musical form is earned by the emotional material, where the decision to sing rather than speak reflects the genuine inadequacy of speaking to what the scene requires. When the decision is made well, the musical form creates an access to emotional content that the regular format forecloses, and the episodes that achieve this are among the most affecting things the show has produced across its long run. The Simpsons has a relationship to violence that is complicated in ways that most analyses of the show sidestep, partly because the violence in the show is almost always played for comedy, and partly because taking the violence seriously as a subject requires engaging with aspects of the show that are more uncomfortable than the comedy frame makes them seem. The violence in The Simpsons is pervasive. This is not a controversial observation. It is visible in the density of physical harm across any given episode's runtime. Homer is struck, falls, is burned, is electrocuted, is crushed, is run over, is shot, is stabbed, at rates that no realistic depiction of human physical experience could accommodate. The violence is continuous and it is survived, which is the formal condition that makes it available for comic use. If the violence had consequences, if Homer's accumulated injuries produced accumulated damage, the comedy would be unavailable. The reversibility of the violence is the condition of its funniness. But the reversibility is also the condition of a specific kind of unease that the comedy sometimes produces rather than prevents, because the reversibility is so complete and so consistent that it creates a world in which harm has no weight. Homer can be harmed infinitely. The harm never accumulates. The man who was crushed last week shows up next week without the crushing having mattered. This is the formal condition of cartoon violence generally, and most discussions of Simpsons violence stop at this level, noting that cartoon violence is different from realistic violence, and that the conventions of the form make the harm available for comic use in ways that realistic depictions of similar harm would not be. This is true, but there is something else worth saying about the specific way The Simpsons deploys cartoon violence, which is that the violence is not uniformly comedic in the emotional register it produces. The violence between Homer and Bart is the most studied, most contested, and most emotionally complicated violence in the show. The strangling reflex, Homer's immediate and automatic physical response to Bart's provocations, has been read in many different ways across the show's history. It has been read as a joke, which is how the show consistently frames it. It has been read as a critique of television's normalization of domestic violence. It has been read as an expression of Homer's fundamental unsuitability as a parent. It has been read as an expression of the specifically frustrated love that parents of difficult children sometimes experience, the love that is so thoroughly mixed with frustration and helplessness that it produces responses that no one involved is comfortable with. All of these readings are available because the scene is genuinely ambiguous in its emotional register. The strangling plays as comedy because of the stylization, because Bart's neck elongates in the way that cartoon necks elongate under cartoon pressure, because the physical consequences are comedically exaggerated rather than realistic. But the emotional content that the stylization contains is real. Homer is genuinely frustrated. Bart is genuinely frightened, at least sometimes, in a way that the stylization and the quick resolution usually prevent from registering. The relationship has a quality of genuine tension underneath the comedy, a quality that the comedy frame both reveals and obscures. The show's relationship to the violence that Springfield's power structures exercise on its residents is where the analysis gets most interesting. The harm that Burns's plant does to Springfield is a form of violence, not the stylized cartoon violence of the strangling reflex, but the sustained, invisible, cumulative violence of environmental contamination, of poisoning a community's water and air and biological environment across decades for the purpose of maintaining a profitable operation. This violence has no comedy frame. It is not presented as something that resolves into funniness. It is presented as a background fact, the condition of Springfield's existence, and it is the most serious violence in the show's universe because it is the violence that shapes everything else. The show's choice to embed this violence in the background rather than foregrounding it is itself a statement. By making it background, by allowing the comedy to proceed in its presence, the show is depicting the relationship that Springfield's residents have to the harm being done to them, which is the relationship of people who have so thoroughly normalized the harm that it no longer registers as something requiring response. The violence is background because it has become background to the people it is being done to. The comedy can proceed in its presence because the comedy has always proceeded in its presence. This is what the show means when it depicts Springfield going on with its life, while the cooling towers continue to steam on the horizon. The violence of economic deprivation, which the show depicts with more accuracy and more consistency than most American television comedies, is similarly a form of harm that the comedy frame manages without eliminating. Homer's financial anxieties, the specific quality of stress that runs through episodes where the family is in financial difficulty, the way that economic pressure produces a specific quality of desperation in people who are otherwise capable of humor and warmth and competence, are all depicted with enough fidelity to what economic deprivation actually feels like that the comedy does not make the deprivation feel trivial. The violence of social exclusion, of Lisa's consistent experience of being too much for the environment around her, of Bart's consistent experience of being the wrong kind, of Homer's consistent experience of not quite belonging in any of the social contexts he tries to inhabit, is the violence that the show is most honest about across its full run. It does not resolve. It does not produce accommodation or growth in the social contexts that are doing the excluding. It is a persistent condition that the characters navigate rather than change, and the navigation is the show's most authentic portrait of how people actually manage within social environments that are not built to accommodate them. The relationship between all of these forms of violence, the cartoon physical harm and the environmental harm and the economic harm and the social harm, is the relationship that the show has been mapping for 36 seasons without ever saying directly what the map shows. The map shows a world in which harm is pervasive and normalized and managed rather than addressed, in which the people being harmed have developed elaborate coping strategies that allow them to function and even to find joy within conditions of sustained harm, and in which the sources of the harm are so thoroughly embedded in the structures that maintain the community's existence that removing them would require dismantling the community. Springfield is not a town that has violence in it. It is a town that is violence, a community whose continued existence depends on the perpetuation of specific forms of harm and whose residents have been living with this long enough that the harm and the community have become inseparable. The comedy that runs on the surface of this is not a denial of what is underneath. It is the residents' primary coping strategy, the way that people who live in genuinely difficult conditions find the space to be alive in those conditions rather than simply crushed by them. This is ultimately what The Simpsons is about. Not the theories and the mysteries, though the theories and the mysteries illuminate specific aspects of it. It is about what it is like to be alive in a world that is doing harm and to find in that world the things worth having. To love people who are not always capable of being the people you need them to be. To care about things that the world around you does not care about in the same way. To keep going through a week that was harder than it needed to be, and to collapse on the couch on Sunday night in the company of the people who chose to be in each other's lives, and to find that the week was, despite everything, worth it. This is what Homer finds every time he finds his way home. The week was hard. The plant was degrading. Burns did not remember his name. Something went wrong that he could not fix. And he is home. The people are there. The beer is cold. The television is on. The couch receives him without judgment. And for the duration of the evening, in this impossible town, in this impossible timeline with these impossible people, it is enough. It has always been enough. That is the show. The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other program in American television history. This is not a close contest. The list runs into the hundreds of names, ranging from genuine A-list stars at the peaks of their cultural prominence to writers and academics and musicians who are well known within specific communities but not broadly famous, to politicians and athletes and figures from domains that television rarely reaches into for guest casting. The accumulation of this many guest appearances across 36 seasons creates a document of American celebrity culture as it evolved over that period, a kind of celebrity archaeology that shows who mattered to American culture in each successive era and in what way they mattered. The guest list is a timeline of cultural prominence, organized by when specific figures were prominent enough to be worth calling and willing to appear, and reading it chronologically gives you a specific portrait of how American celebrity changed between the late 1980s and the mid-2020s. The show's approach to its guests has not been consistent across its run. The earliest significant guest appearances were managed with a specific philosophy that distinguished The Simpsons from most talk shows and variety programs that were also booking celebrities at the time. The celebrities in The Simpsons were required to play versions of themselves that engaged with the material, rather than simply appearing as name recognition to be pointed at. If you were Michael Jackson on The Simpsons, you were not simply Michael Jackson standing next to Homer and being recognized as Michael Jackson. You were Michael Jackson doing something specific to the story that Michael Jackson being in the story made possible, something that required the specific resonances of your presence rather than simply your presence. This approach to celebrity casting is more demanding than the standard approach and produces better results because it requires the production to think about why a specific person matters to the story rather than simply whether a specific person would be noticed by the audience. The discipline this requires is one of the things that distinguished the peak Simpsons celebrity appearances from what followed them. The decline of this discipline in later seasons is visible in the structure of the guest appearances. Later guest appearances are more often structured around the recognition event, around the moment when a character realizes who they are talking to and reacts with the appropriate level of amazement, rather than around what the celebrity's specific presence makes possible in the story. The celebrity becomes an event to be pointed at rather than a resource to be used, and the difference in quality between these two approaches is immediately visible once you know to look for it. The guest appearances that have aged best are the ones where the celebrity is playing against type in specific ways that the show found useful for its purposes. When a celebrity associated with one set of cultural meanings appears in a context that creates friction with those meanings, when the gap between what the celebrity signifies and what the context requires of them generates something that neither the celebrity's usual persona nor the show's usual approach could produce alone, the guest appearance becomes genuinely interesting, rather than simply notable. These moments are rarer than the show's overall guest volume would suggest, but they are among the most memorable things in the show's history. The musicians who have appeared in The Simpsons deserve special attention because music is the domain where the show has consistently demonstrated the most genuine engagement with the art form it is featuring. The musical guests in The Simpsons are not simply recognizable faces being pointed at. They are musicians whose music matters to the episodes they appear in, whose presence changes the musical texture of the show in specific ways that the story requires. Tom Jones's appearance is the canonical example of this, but there are many others. The pattern in the best musical guest appearances is that the musician's specific musical identity, not their fame, but their actual sonic and cultural identity, is integrated into what the episode needs at the specific moment they appear. The music they make in the episode is music that specific musician would make, that sounds like that musician rather than like a generic approximation of their style. This requires real engagement with the musician's actual work, not simply booking a famous name and pointing the camera at them. The academic and intellectual guests are the category that most directly reflects the specific educational demographics of the writing staff. Writers who hold advanced degrees in various fields and who have spent significant time in academic environments have specific relationships with specific intellectual figures that general audiences do not share, and some of the show's guest casting reflects those relationships in ways that are legible to a small audience and invisible to a large one. These appearances are the clearest evidence of the show being made by specific people with specific cultural formations, rather than by a generic production process aimed at a generic audience. When a novelist or a philosopher or a scientist appears in The Simpsons and is engaged with on the basis of their actual intellectual work, rather than their name recognition, you are seeing the production acting on its own genuine intellectual enthusiasms, rather than on its understanding of what the audience would recognize. These moments are gifts to a small audience from a production that cared enough about that small audience to make the gift, even at the cost of producing moments that the larger audience would look past without recognition. There is a specific and unusual challenge that faces any creative work that survives long enough to become a classic while it is still being produced. The work must continue to exist alongside its own legacy, must keep making new episodes in the shadow of the episodes that are now considered canonical, must somehow be both the ongoing show and the historical artifact of what the show was at its best. The Simpsons has been navigating this challenge for approximately 2 decades, and the navigation has produced a specific quality in the later seasons that is unlike anything else in American television. The show is self-aware about its own history in ways that shape what it can attempt in its present And the self-awareness is sometimes liberating and sometimes constraining in ways that are visible in specific episodes. The show's relationship to nostalgia is the most complex aspect of this navigation. The later Simpsons is producing episodes for an audience that has a nostalgic relationship with the earlier Simpsons, an audience that watches the current show through the lens of its memory of the earlier show, and that evaluates each new episode partly against the remembered quality of the episodes that formed its initial relationship with the series. This is a nearly impossible standard to consistently meet, because the memory of the earlier episodes has been filtered through decades of the specific enhancement that memory applies to formative experiences. The episodes from the first 8 or 9 seasons are not simply good episodes. For the people who encountered them in real time, at the ages when first encounter with significant creative work leaves the most lasting impressions, those episodes are also the experiences of encountering something genuinely excellent at a specific moment in their lives, and that experiential dimension of the memory is not something the current show can replicate. The current show can make excellent episodes. It cannot make first encounters. What the later Simpsons has found to do with its awareness of its own nostalgia is interesting and, at its best, genuinely creative. The show has developed a specific relationship to its own continuity that treats the accumulated history of the show as a resource rather than a burden. Episodes that call back to earlier episodes, that weave threads from the show's past into their present narratives, are doing something more than simple fan service. They are acknowledging that the audience's relationship to Springfield is a historical relationship, that the town has a history in the audience's memory as well as in the show's continuity, and that this historical dimension is part of what Springfield is. The most successful continuity callbacks in the later seasons are the ones where the earlier material is genuinely necessary to the emotional logic of the current episode, where something about the character or the relationship or the situation requires the earlier episode's events to be true in order for what the current episode is doing to have full weight. These callbacks feel like the show remembering its own history because it needs to rather than because it can. And the distinction between needing and being able to is the difference between a callback that works and one that feels like a museum exhibit. The self-referential quality that has become more prominent in the later seasons, the show's willingness to comment on its own nature as a long-running animated series, to make jokes about the floating timeline and the reset button, and the question of whether the show should still be on the air, is the most direct expression of the show's awareness of its own legacy. These moments are often funny in a specific way that requires the audience to share the show's awareness of itself, to be complicit in the joke about the show's continued existence and its relationship to the show it used to be. The risk of this self-referential mode is that it can substitute awareness for quality, can produce the impression of honesty about the show's situation without actually doing anything honest. A joke about the show's quality is not the same thing as good quality. Acknowledging that the show has changed is not the same thing as changing back. The self-awareness can become its own form of comfort, a way of acknowledging the gap between what the show was and what it is, without the discomfort of genuinely attempting to close the gap. The episodes that avoid this risk, the later episodes that are genuinely good rather than self-aware about not always being genuinely good, are the evidence that the show is still capable of the thing it was always capable of, just less reliably and with more effort required to sustain it across a full episode. The capability remains. The conditions that reliably produced it have changed. What has changed is the subject of this entire section, and the honest account of it is the most respectful thing that can be said about a show that produced something as genuinely excellent as the peak Simpsons, and has continued to exist in its wake. The show's awareness of its own predictions, the cultural phenomenon of The Simpsons having apparently foretold future events, is the most recent and in some ways most interesting addition to the self-referential dimension of the later seasons. The prediction phenomenon has become part of the show's identity in the culture in ways that the show itself has had to engage with, and the engagement has been interesting. The show has made jokes about its own predictive reputation that are both funny and genuinely thoughtful about what the phenomenon actually is. The show understands, at the level where it is self-aware about its own nature, that the prediction phenomenon is primarily a phenomenon about how confirmation bias operates at the scale of 800 episodes containing thousands of observations about American culture. It knows that the hits are remembered and the misses are forgotten. It knows that the cultural significance of a prediction is not evidence of prophetic ability, but of cultural pervasiveness, of having been sufficiently embedded in the culture for long enough that its observations have become reference points. But the show also has enough honesty about its own best work to acknowledge that some of the predictions are more than simple statistical inevitability, that some of the moments where the show's observations appear to have anticipated future events reflect genuine insight into the trajectory of American culture, rather than simply the inevitability of a large enough sample producing coincidental matches. The show was, at its best, making intelligent observations about where American culture was heading based on where it was, and some of those observations turned out to be more accurate than the satirical exaggeration they were deployed as suggested they would be. This is both a testament to the quality of the thinking that went into the peak seasons and a commentary on the quality of the cultural trajectory that made those observations accurate. The show predicted certain things correctly, not because it had access to information that others did not have, but because it was paying careful attention to things that most people were not paying careful attention to, and it extended those things to their logical conclusions with more precision than comfort would permit. The American culture that The Simpsons was observing and satirizing in the early 1990s has, in specific ways, developed in the directions that the satire identified. The satire was not wrong about the direction. It was optimistic about the rate. Things that the show depicted as absurd exaggerations of existing tendencies turned out to be, in some cases, underestimates. And the show has had to live with this, has had to keep producing episodes about a Springfield that was supposed to be an exaggeration of America in a period when America has in some ways caught up to, and in some ways exceeded the exaggeration. This is perhaps the strangest achievement of The Simpsons' long run. It has outlasted the relationship between satire and reality that made it work. The gap that satire requires, the space between the absurd exaggeration and the reality being exaggerated, has narrowed in some domains to the point where what the show depicts is no longer clearly an exaggeration. A show that was made as a satirical portrait of American dysfunction has watched American dysfunction develop in directions that have made the portrait look increasingly like journalism. The show has responded to this in ways that are visible in specific episodes of the later seasons, episodes that seem to be grappling with the question of what satirical comedy does when the target has met the satire halfway. The answer that the best of these episodes find is that what satire does is continue, is maintain the perspective and the distance that allows it to do what comedy has always done, which is to make visible what direct discussion would obscure. The comedy is not defeated by the reality catching up to it. The comedy is required by the reality catching up to it, because the reality that has met the satire halfway is a reality that is still doing the things the satire identified, still in the directions the satire identified, and still in need of the specific form of visibility that comedy provides. Springfield is still there, the cooling towers are still steaming, Burns is still alive, Homer is still at the plant, the fish still have 3 eyes in the river, and the show is still on, making episodes about a family in an impossible town that is somehow the most recognizable place in America. That is the achievement, not the individual episodes, though the individual episodes include some of the finest comedy ever produced for American television. Not the theories, though the theories illuminate real and interesting aspects of the show's universe. Not the predictions, though the predictions are genuinely impressive in ways that statistical inevitability does not fully account for. The achievement is persistence. The achievement is presence. The achievement is that 36 years after a yellow family first appeared on a couch on a Sunday night, they are still there, and we are still watching, and the town is still impossible, and something about its impossibility is the most truthful thing about it. Springfield is where we go when we need the kind of truth that only impossible places can provide. It is open. It is always open. Every episode of The Simpsons has a couch gag, an opening sequence, a series of jokes that fire before the story proper has begun. The opening sequence is so embedded in how the show is experienced that it has become invisible, the thing you watch and stop watching after enough repetitions. But the opening sequence is doing specific things that reward attention, things that the story that follows does not do and cannot do because the story has plot requirements that prevent it from simply observing Springfield for 30 unstructured seconds. The chalkboard gag is the most clearly authored element of the opening, the most clearly the product of a specific decision on a specific day about what Bart is being punished for having said or done, and the range of chalkboard content across the show's run is a document of the specific preoccupations of the writing staff in the weeks when those episodes were being finished. The chalkboard gags that address real-world events, that place a specific cultural or political situation in the frame of a child being punished for having an opinion about it, are the ones that most directly encode the production's relationship to its moment. The skateboard run through Springfield that follows the chalkboard gag is, across the many variations the sequence has undergone across 36 seasons, a tour of the town that functions as an establishing sequence in the literal sense. It establishes what Springfield contains, what its geography looks like from street level, what the texture of the town feels like at speed. The sequence changes regularly, updating the town's appearance to reflect changes in the show's animation quality and changes in the specific population of buildings and features that Springfield has been established as containing. Reading the sequence across seasons is reading the show's evolving understanding of what Springfield is. The early sequence has a scruffier and more handmade quality that reflects both the animation standards of the period and a specific aesthetic intention about what Springfield should look like, one that was gradually refined across subsequent seasons into something cleaner and more polished, without losing the fundamental character that makes Springfield recognizable across every version of it. The saxophone solo that accompanies the sequence is one of the most recognizable pieces of incidental music in the history of American television, and it earns that recognition. It is a melody that manages to be both immediately distinctive and somehow exactly right for the sequence it accompanies, capturing a quality of the familiar made slightly strange that is exactly what Springfield is. You hear the melody and you know where you are. You are in Springfield. The music makes it impossible to be anywhere else. The couch gag is the element of the opening that has received the most sustained creative investment across the show's run, and the evolution of the couch gag from a simple visual joke about the family arriving at the couch in various physical configurations to the elaborate, extended, genre-crossing, animator showcase pieces that the later seasons produced is one of the clearest visual documentations of the show's evolving creative ambitions. The early couch gags are quick and simple. The family arrives, something physically surprising happens involving the couch or the family's physical form, and the sequence resolves. The simplicity is appropriate to the early season's aesthetic and to the function the couch gag was designed to serve, which is to finish the opening on a note of visual surprise that transitions into the episode's cold open with the audience's attention fully engaged. The later couch gags, particularly the ones produced by guest animators and artists with distinctive visual styles of their own, are fully realized short films that have a formal ambition independent of the show they nominally open. The guest animator couch gags are the show inviting other creative voices to use the framing of the family on the couch as a canvas for their own vision of what that image means, and the range of what different artists have found in that image, from the quietly beautiful to the genuinely disturbing, is a document of how widely the show's central premise can be interpreted. The Simpsons theme played over the end credits of each episode has received essentially no critical attention, despite being a recurring piece of music that has accompanied the conclusions of hundreds of episodes across 36 years. This is partly because end credits are the moment when most viewers are already moving on, already processing what they have just watched or reaching for the remote, and the music that plays over them is received as transitional sound rather than as something worth attending to. But the end credits theme is a specific piece of music with a specific emotional register, and the emotion it produces, something between completion and wistfulness, is the correct emotional register for the end of a Simpsons episode. The wistfulness is the interesting part. End credits music in American television usually aims for resolution, for a feeling of completion that releases the audience from the emotional demands of the episode they have just watched. The Simpsons end credits theme does produce a feeling of completion, but it also produces something that completion alone would not produce, a quality of things still ongoing, of the life of Springfield continuing past the episode's end, of characters returning to the existence that the episode interrupted, rather than arriving at a rest state that will persist until the next episode begins. This is the correct feeling for a floating timeline. The characters are not resting between episodes. They are living, in Springfield, in the permanent present, doing the things they do in the spaces between the episodes that the show has decided to depict. The end credits theme acknowledges this, holds the ongoing quality of Springfield's existence against the completion of this particular hour's visit, and sends you back to your own ongoing existence with the reminder that Springfield is still there, still running, still yellow and impossible and deeply familiar, waiting for next week, What the end credits do not show you is what happens after Homer gets home, after the specific story the episode told has been resolved or left unresolved, in the specific way Simpsons episodes resolve or do not resolve. They do not show you Marge at the kitchen counter an hour later, thinking about what happened. They do not show you Bart in his room, in the quiet after whatever the day contained. They do not show you Lisa with her saxophone, working through something. They do not show you Maggie, watching, in the darkness of her room, processing everything she has seen and heard and understood in a way that nobody around her suspects she is understanding. The Simpsons does not show you the interior life of its characters directly. It shows you the exterior, the events, the dialogue, the physical comedy, and it trusts you to infer the interior from what is visible. This trust is part of what makes the show work as a long-form character study, because the characters whose interior lives we infer feel more real than the characters whose interior lives are narrated to us, feel like people we know rather than people we have been told about. Springfield after closing time is the Springfield that exists in the space between what the show depicts and what the show implies, and it is more populated and more specific and more interesting than any episode could directly contain. It is the Springfield where Ned Flanders sits in his living room after the boys are asleep, in the quiet that the conditioning fills with peace that is not quite the same as peace. Where Apu runs the numbers in the back office of the Quick E-Mart, long after midnight, the store empty except for the fluorescent lights and the sound of the refrigerated display cases humming. Where Mo sits at the bar after the last customer has gone, not yet cleaning up, not quite ready to go home, in the specific loneliness of a person whose work is over for the night and whose life, past the work, is a smaller room. Where Lisa is awake, in the quiet of the house, thinking about everything, holding the saxophone she will not play because everyone else is sleeping. Where Springfield holds its impossible geography, its ocean and its mountains and its desert and its gorge, all present simultaneously in the night air, the steam from the cooling towers drifting south over the residential streets, invisible and unavoidable, the town breathing out what the day produced. This is the Springfield between episodes, the Springfield that continues. The town where the stories are not over when the credits roll, where the characters are not on pause until next Sunday, where the life the show depicts is not the show's invention but the life that the show has earned the right to be about, by paying enough attention to it for long enough that the fictional characters have become as real as the real people they were built to represent. The Simpsons has been about something real for 36 years. It has been about what it is like to be alive in America, to try to love the people in your life and to mostly fail and to try again, to go to work for someone who does not care about you and to come home to people who do, to live in a world that is full of things that are wrong and to find in that world the things that are worth having. It has been about that, in Springfield, every week, for longer than most of us can remember a time before it. And it is still there. The window is still lit. Homer is still watching television. Marge is beside him. The children are in their rooms. The cooling towers are steaming against the sky. And wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is there, Springfield is open. It always is. Before we close, let's do something that feels right for a video that has been walking through Springfield for this long. Let's take stock of what we actually found down here, in the parts of the iceberg below the famous theories, below the radiation and the coma and the who shot Burns debates that everyone who has spent time in Springfield knows. What we found is a show that was doing more than it appeared to be doing, not hiding it exactly. The show was never hiding any of this. It was simply building a world detailed enough that looking at it closely, which is what we have been doing, produces something different from looking at it casually, which is what most of the audience does most of the time. The world rewards the close look. It was built to. We found a geography that was designed to be everywhere at once, that places Springfield in every American town by refusing to let it be any specific American town. We found a writer's room that was doing things with collective creative process that produced specific qualities of excellence that the individual talent in that room could not have produced alone and could not replicate after the specific collective dispersed. We found background characters who were built more completely than the show required, who carry implied histories that the episodes never tell directly, but that the accumulated visual evidence allows you to reconstruct. We found a horror tradition that, at its best, was not using horror as a vehicle for comedy, but using comedy as a vehicle for genuine engagement with what horror does and means. We found character backstories that opened onto darkness that the comedy frame does not close, that remain open in the accumulated episodes as doors into territory the show identified and then stepped back from. We found an economy that does not work, that the show depicts with enough accuracy to constitute a genuine portrait of how economics function in communities like Springfield, which is to say how they function in communities where a single large actor has enough economic power to shape everything else. We found a history of unmade episodes and abandoned storylines that is a map of what the show wanted to be and of the forces that shaped what it was allowed to be. We found real people behind the fictional faces, real relationships and real experiences processed through animation into characters that have outlasted the specific circumstances that produced them. We found a show's honest engagement with death and grief, embedded in comedy that makes it accessible without making it easy, that accumulates across 36 seasons into something worth calling a record of how loss feels in the specific texture of ordinary life. We found a theological universe where God talks to Homer and is silent for Ned, which is either a cosmic joke or the most precise statement the show has ever made about how divine attention works, or possibly both simultaneously. We found a philosophical core organized around the question of choice within constraint, around what it means to be responsible for your life when the conditions of your life were not your responsibility. And we found a show that has been doing all of this for 36 years, quietly, in the background of the comedy, available to anyone who wanted to look for it, and entirely undemanding of anyone who did not. The show has never required you to know any of this. It works as comedy without any of it. The depth is there for the people who want depth, and it does not get in the way of the laughter for the people who are there for the laughter. This is the rarest quality in popular entertainment. Most things that are deep are demanding about their depth. They require the depth to be engaged with. They structure the experience around the depth. They make you work for the comedy or the entertainment, or whatever the surface pleasure is in exchange for the depth beneath it. The Simpsons has never done this. It has always put the comedy first, always made the laughter primary and the depth available, always made sure that the surface was good enough that no one had to go deeper to have a satisfying experience. The iceberg metaphor that gives this video its name is accurate in ways beyond the obvious. What is visible above the water is large and recognizable and genuinely impressive. What is below the water is many times larger, and most people who see the visible portion have no reason to suspect the scale of what the surface conceals. But the weight of what is below the water is what keeps the visible portion stable, what gives the whole structure the ballast that has allowed it to persist in the same position through decades of weather. The visible portion of The Simpsons, the comedy and the characters, and the cultural pervasiveness is what everyone sees. The invisible portion is what has kept it afloat. We have been down here for a while now. We have been in the parts of Springfield that the episodes themselves do not directly illuminate. And what we found is not a show in decline, not a cultural artifact past its relevance, not something that should have ended at some point in the late 1990s when many fans believe its essential work was done. What we found is a world, an impossible world made from the materials of the real one, filtered through specific and talented people's understanding of those materials, maintained across 36 years of sustained collective effort into something that has no precise equivalent in American cultural history. It is still there. The light is still on. Good night.